There is a moment in the episode where Rick and Morty first visit the Citadel of Ricks, where the camera pulls back and reveals an entire city built around infinite copies of the same man. And Rick, the singular one, the irreplaceable one, the man who told you for 2 seasons that he operated above the level of anyone else in the known universe, just stands in the middle of it, surrounded by himself, looking, for just a second, completely ordinary. The show does not stop to let you feel that. There is a joke about something else within seconds, and you are already moving. Almost nobody talks about how quietly devastating that image is, or what it actually means for every scene that came before it. Tonight, we are going through the entire Rick and Morty iceberg, from the stuff sitting right at the surface, the things the show itself is happy to explain if you sit with it long enough, down through the production histories and the hidden details, the fan theories built so carefully from available evidence that they nearly function as canon, the real-world events that changed how the show reads, and all the way to the questions the series has been carrying since the pilot without ever fully answering them. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down. We will be here for a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. The surface of the iceberg is where most conversations about Rick and Morty begin and end. The familiar stuff, the known stuff. But even here, if you look carefully, there are details that reward more attention than they typically get. Rick and Morty premiered in December of 2013 on Adult Swim. Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon created it together, and from the very first scene, the show established a tone that was unlike almost anything else airing on American television at the time. The pilot opens mid-action, with Rick dragging a very drunk Morty out of bed at 3 a.m. to announce that he has built a bomb designed to wipe out all of humanity so that he and Morty can repopulate the species together. He is weeping. He is slurring badly. He is terrifyingly sincere. And then it turns out to be a dream. Morty wakes up. School, breakfast, an ordinary suburban morning. The camera pulls back, the theme music plays, and you are already inside something that is not quite what it looks like on the surface. What those first 90 seconds establish is the central dynamic that the show would spend years interrogating. Rick is dangerous, and specifically dangerous to Morty. Morty is being pulled into that danger whether he wants to be or not. The family around them is barely functional by any conventional measure. Beth is a horse surgeon who married too young and has never fully come to terms with what that meant for her life. Jerry is a man who has long since recognized that he is the least impressive person in any room and has built an entire personality around surviving that recognition. Summer is a teenager performing indifference so convincingly you almost believe her. And Morty is the connective tissue of the whole arrangement, the emotional center of a show that often performs having no center. The origin of the show begins one step further back than the pilot. Justin Roiland made a short animated film for Channel 101, a platform that Dan Harmon co-founded. And that short was a parody of Back to the Future. It was deliberately crude in several registers at once. The characters were named Doc and Marty. The humor was aggressively absurdist and provocative in a way that reflected what Roiland was doing with the premise rather than what the premise eventually became. When Harmon saw it, something clicked. The two of them recognized that the dynamic underneath the parody, an older, brilliant, unstable man and a younger, more sensitive companion whose sensitivity was being constantly overwhelmed by the older man's chaos, had genuine storytelling potential if you took it seriously enough. The renaming matters. Doc and Marty became Rick and Morty. Rick is a common working-class name. It has none of the grandeur of a superhero name or the comic remove of an obviously satirical one. Morty is gentle, slightly old-fashioned. It sounds like someone your grandfather might mention in passing. Both names are deliberately unassuming, and the unassumingness is part of the point. The show wanted to locate its enormous philosophical territory inside something that felt domestic, specific, and recognizable. The show draws from several creative traditions simultaneously, and understanding those traditions helps clarify what it is attempting. Dan Harmon is an avowed student of narrative structure, specifically a framework he derived from his reading of Joseph Campbell and Kurt Vonnegut, which he has described publicly as a story circle. A character begins in a zone of comfort. They have a need or a want. They cross into unfamiliar territory. They encounter what they were looking for. They pay a price for it. They return to their zone of comfort fundamentally changed. This structure underlies virtually every episode of Rick and Morty, even the ones that appear to be abandoning structure entirely. The circle is always there, sometimes buried, sometimes inverted, sometimes running simultaneously at multiple scales. What Harmon does with this structure that is genuinely unusual is apply it at multiple levels at the same time. Individual scenes follow it, episodes follow it, seasons follow it. The entire series arguably is following a version of it, though where the final return and the change will land is not yet determined. The voice performances cannot be separated from what the show is. Justin Roiland voices both Rick and Morty, and the performances were improvisational to a degree unusual in animation production. In a standard animated production, the recording process is relatively controlled. Scripts are finalized, performances are recorded to match the script, and the final edit is shaped around those recordings. Roiland's approach was more exploratory. He would come into the recording booth with the script, and he would also depart from it frequently, finding things in the performance that the text had not anticipated and that the text could not have generated. The distinctive burp that interrupts Rick's sentences was improvised. The way Rick begins a thought with supreme rhetorical confidence and then seems to lose the thread of it somewhere in the middle was improvised. Many of the best remembered individual lines in the show emerged from Roiland in the booth rather than from the page. This matters for how you understand the show's primary voice. Rick does not sound like a scripted character who has been given a distinctive verbal style. He sounds like a person who is improvising his own persona in real time, constructing the performance of himself in the moment, which is, if you think about it, exactly what Rick is doing. The performance captures something true about the character that the text alone would not have found. The show aired its first season across late 2013 and into 2014, and the second season ran through the summer and fall of 2015. These first two seasons established the formal language of the show. Its willingness to go to extremely dark places in a single episode and then return to baseline the following week without addressing what happened. Its use of science fiction premises to explore questions that are emotional and philosophical rather than technological. Its construction of an ongoing mythology that sat at the edges of nominally self-contained episodes without ever announcing itself as the main event. The Season 1 episode, titled Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, introduces two of the show's most significant ongoing elements in the same hour of television: the citadel of Ricks and evil Morty. The premise of the episode is that Rick C-137, the specific Rick whose story we have been following, is accused by a governing body of interdimensional Ricks of murdering other Ricks across multiple dimensions. He is hunted, arrested, and brought before the Council of Ricks, a body made up of representatives from the infinite parallel versions of Rick scattered across the multiverse. Rick C-137 is the only Rick who has refused to join this council. He is, in the council's framing, a rogue element, the single Rick who will not cooperate with the system everyone else has agreed to participate in. The episode reveals that the actual murderer is a Morty, one who has been surgically modified to control a Rick as a puppet, using the Rick as a remote-operated decoy. This Morty frames Rick C-137 and escapes at the episode's conclusion. The camera holds on his face as he walks away. He is smiling. The show gives you no explanation of what he wants or what he intends to do next. It just lets him go and cuts to something else. This single episode does several things simultaneously that the show will keep building on for years. It establishes that the multiverse of Ricks has been organized into a governing body with real institutional power. It establishes that Rick C-137 is exceptional even among Ricks in his refusal of collective organization. It establishes the mechanical function of the Rick-Morty pairing, that Morty's chaotic non-genius brainwaves cancel out the distinctive frequency of Rick's genius brainwaves, making Rick harder to detect and track. Mortys are not companions in the warm sense first. They are camouflage. They are the practical solution to a surveillance problem, and it establishes the existence of a Morty who has decided to act against this system rather than function within it. This last element will not be revisited in any direct way until Season 3, which means the show spends roughly 4 years of its life holding that escaped smiling Morty in reserve, letting the audience wonder, before returning to him. The Season 2 finale, titled The Wedding Squanchers, is the show at peak serialized ambition. Rick's oldest friend, Bird Person, is getting married on a bird planet, and the whole family attends. The wedding goes terribly wrong when it is revealed that the bride is an agent of the Galactic Federation, the governing body that Rick has been in running conflict with throughout the series. Bird Person is shot and killed. The family flees across dimensions. And Rick, cornered, makes a choice that the show has been quietly building toward without announcing it. He turns himself over to the Federation. He gives himself up in order to ensure his family's safety. The last scene of the episode shows Rick in a prison cell. The camera pulls slowly back and the prison reveals itself to be enormous, planetary or larger in scale. Rick, who spent the entirety of seasons 1 and 2 presenting himself as the most capable and free person in any room, is alone in a cell, having voluntarily surrendered because the alternative was danger to the people he spent those same seasons performing not caring about. The Season 2 finale lands with the weight of everything that came before it. And then, nothing happened for nearly 2 years. The gap between Season 2 and Season 3 became its own cultural event, separate from the show itself. Adult Swim announced during this period that the show had been renewed for 70 episodes, which was an extraordinary commitment. The production was slow. Dan Harmon's process is meticulous. The show's ambitions for Season 3 were significant. The gap stretched from October of 2015 to July of 2017. What happened during those nearly 2 years with the fan community is worth understanding. Rick and Morty had developed one of the most intensely engaged fan cultures of any animated series in recent memory. The theories and analyses were not casual. They were extended, rigorous, architecturally elaborate. People had built comprehensive readings of the show's mythology that were extremely detailed and sometimes extremely compelling. And the longer the wait, the more attached people became to those readings, to the point where a version of fandom had developed in which the show was in some sense the property of the people who had analyzed it most thoroughly. When Season 3 arrived, it did so through a move that was formally perfect and practically chaotic. An April Fool's episode dropped at midnight on April 1st of 2017 with no announcement. The episode, titled The Rick Shank Rickdemption, was the Season 3 premiere, and it included a moment that became the center of one of the strangest media events of that year. In the episode, Rick delivers a monologue in which he explains his deepest motivation, the thing he has been working toward across all his adventures, his true purpose. And that purpose, delivered with mounting intensity and apparent sincerity, is to obtain the McDonald's Szechuan dipping sauce that was produced as a limited promotional item in 1997 to coincide with the release of the animated film Mulan. He presents this as the profound revelation of his nature. It is clearly a joke. Rick is doing exactly what Rick does, using the register of deep significance to point at something deliberately trivial. Because the alternative is using the register of deep significance to point at something actually deep, which is the one thing Rick cannot allow himself. A portion of the audience received this as a genuine statement. McDonald's brought back the sauce in a limited run in October of 2017. The response at some restaurant locations was national news. There were crowds, extended waits, and documented incidents of behavior that required police presence at certain locations. Harmon and Roiland both made public statements. Harmon's was pointed. He expressed genuine discomfort with what had happened and made clear that neither he nor the show endorsed the behavior or the culture that had produced it. The Szechuan incident sits in the iceberg not to be relitigated at length, but because it illuminates something real about the show's relationship to its audience. Rick and Morty makes nihilism and contempt feel intelligent, makes them feel like the position held by the most capable character in the room, and then it systematically and repeatedly undercuts those qualities. It shows you the cost. The nihilism always produces suffering. The contempt always costs someone something. The show's argument is not that Rick is correct. The show's argument is that Rick is interesting and damaged, and that his worldview, internally consistent as it is, generates suffering in everyone around him and eventually in him as well. The question of whether the audience was meant to be seduced by Rick or meant to see through him was never cleanly resolved by the show, and the Szechuan moment was the first time that unresolved ambiguity produced real-world consequences. Season 3, which aired across the summer and fall of 2017, is complicated to assess. It contains some of the finest individual episodes the series produced. It also contains episodes that received more mixed responses than anything in the first 2 seasons. The season overall has a different energy from the first 2, more self-aware about its own reputation, more interested in commenting on the show's cultural position, which creates some moments of genuine brilliance and some moments that feel like commentary wearing the costume of storytelling. The episode that received the most unambiguous critical praise is the Ricklantis Mix-Up, which aired as the 7th episode of the season. This episode does not feature the Rick and Morty we have been following. It is set entirely on the Citadel of Ricks, following characters we have never met before in stories we have not been set up for. The regular Rick and Morty are mentioned briefly in the cold open and then not seen again. The episode follows 4 parallel storylines running simultaneously. A Rick police officer and a Morty police officer are partnered together for a shift that escalates into something neither of them can handle cleanly. A factory Morty who works a repetitive job and who represents the systematic suppression of ambition in the Citadel's Morty underclass. A group of young Ricks and Mortys in what functions as a reform school for delinquent versions of themselves. And a Morty candidate running for the Citadel's governing council as the first Morty candidate in the institution's history. Each of these storylines is a political parable. The Citadel is a society with Ricks at the top of every institutional hierarchy and Mortis systemically subordinated. The episode shows how this hierarchy works at the level of policing, of labor, of education, and of politics. The comedy is layered over genuine observation. The Morty cop discovers that justice on the Citadel is not justice, but the enforcement of an existing order that was never built to serve anyone like him. The horror on his face when this becomes clear is played with complete seriousness. The episode ends with the Morty presidential candidate winning the election, a victory presented as a historical breakthrough. Then the winning Morty turns, and his eye patch is visible, and you recognize him as the same Morty who smiled and walked away at the end of Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind in the first season. Evil Morty, president of the Citadel now. The final shot is him having eliminated every Rick who voted for him, the bodies drifting in space outside the station. The episode is a masterwork of tonal control, comedy and genuine political horror woven together so tightly the seams are invisible. All of its exposition delivered through action and character rather than explanation, and the mythology payload dropped at the very end with the minimum possible ceremony. The reveal is not dramatized. It is shown briefly and the episode ends. You are expected to have been paying attention. We are going deeper now into the production history and the real-world context that changes how the show reads. Dan Harmon has been remarkably open over the years about the autobiographical elements of his work. He has said in interviews that Rick is a processed and exaggerated version of certain tendencies he recognizes in himself. The use of intelligence as a defense against intimacy, the contempt for ordinary social requirements, the alcoholism, the patterns of connection that end in self-sabotage. This is not to say that Harmon is Rick. The character is pushed far beyond anything that maps to a real person's life. But the emotional Dina, the specific architecture of what Rick is protecting himself from, and what methods he uses to protect himself, those come from a place that is familiar to Harmon in ways he has acknowledged publicly. The Pickle Rick episode, which aired in Season 3, is the place where this autobiographical dimension is most concentrated, and Harmon has said as much. The premise is that Rick transforms himself into a pickle at the exact moment the family is scheduled for a therapy session, in order to avoid attending. This is the coldest possible description of what happens. What it misses is the level of commitment involved. Rick as a pickle constructs an elaborate system to turn himself back, manages to get himself through a drain into a sewer, constructs functional limbs out of the bodies of rats and insects, fights his way through a government facility, and eventually delivers a philosophical monologue to a therapist about why therapy is for people who lack the capacity for greatness. The level of effort expended to avoid therapy is exactly the show's point. You do not go to those lengths to avoid something that does not matter. The lengths are the confession. Rick will spend more energy avoiding the thing he needs than it would take to simply do the thing. And he does it flawlessly, resourcefully, with genuine brilliance, which is also part of the point. The same intelligence that could be used to address the underlying problem is being used to avoid it, and the avoidance is so impressive that it almost obscures what is being avoided. The therapy scene itself, when Rick finally arrives at the end of the episode, contains the show's most direct statement about Rick's character. Dr. Wong, the family's therapist, delivers a speech to Rick that the show gives her without undermining it. She tells him that he chooses to be a pickle rather than attend therapy because therapy would require him to change. That his strategy is to find increasingly elaborate ways to avoid the discomfort of looking at what he has done and what he is doing. That he can debate her on intellectual grounds, but that the debate is itself the evasion, another version of the pickle. Rick's response is a rhetorical counter-argument that is genuinely impressive and completely inadequate as a response to what she has said. He goes home. He drinks. The episode ends. Susan Sarandon voiced Dr. Wong in the original episodes, and the performance is worth noting as a production detail. The casting of a recognizably warm and authoritative voice for the therapist gives the character a weight she might not have had with a less distinctive choice. Dr. Wong is the only character in the show who sees Rick clearly and is not particularly impressed or frightened by what she sees, and the casting reinforces this. Justin Roiland's departure from the series in January of 2023 changed the show in a way that was fundamental and that the show itself did not address directly. Adult Swim cut ties with Roiland following legal and personal circumstances that were documented across numerous reporting outlets. Season 7, which aired in the fall of 2023, recasted both primary roles. Ian Cardoni took on Rick, and Harry Belden took on Morty. The show made no in-fiction announcement about this change. The episodes aired with the new voices, and the series continued. The responses covered a wide range and continue to cover it. Some viewers found the recasting successful enough that the show felt continuous, that what made Rick and Morty was the writing and the structure and the relationships rather than the specific qualities of the original performances. Others found that something irreplaceable was gone, that Roiland's improvisational quality, the feeling of a performance finding the character in the moment rather than reproducing a settled interpretation, was something the new casting could not fully replicate. Both responses are understandable, and both are probably partially correct. What is interesting, from the Iceberg perspective, is what the show's own mythology offers as a frame for this. The show has been asking since its first episode, which Rick is the real Rick? Which Morty is the real Morty? The existence of infinite parallel versions means that the specific voice, the specific inflection, the specific improvised line, is already positioned by the show's own logic as one version of many rather than the one true version. There is presumably an infinite range of ways that Rick Sanchez could sound. The character is bigger than any particular performance of him. Whether this philosophical frame is enough to absorb the practical loss of the original performances is a question the show is still, across its most recent seasons, in the process of answering. We go deeper still into the structural elements of the show that reward sustained analytical attention. The show operates on two simultaneous tracks that run parallel without ever fully merging. The first track is episodic. Each episode presents a self-contained problem, something goes wrong, adventures escalate, a resolution of some kind is reached, and the family ends the episode in approximately the same position they began. The second track is serialized. It runs underneath the episodic surface, advancing arcs across seasons and across the show's entire run, Rick's backstory and its gradual revelation, Evil Morty's long game project, the evolution of the family's relationships, and the slowly accumulating portrait of what Rick actually is underneath the persona he maintains. What is genuinely unusual about this two-track structure is how deliberately the show refuses to let the serialized track become the dominant one. Most serialized dramas, shows with ongoing mythology and evolving character arcs, make the mythology the main event. Rick and Morty keeps its mythology at the margins, dropping significant revelations at the ends of episodes that were nominally about something else, burying its most important character moments in episodes whose surface premise seems unrelated. The Ricklantis mix-up delivers its Evil Morty reveal at the very end of an episode that spent its entire runtime following different characters. The Rick origin story in the Season 5 finale is embedded in an episode that opens as an action-adventure tribute to a specific genre of animated filmmaking. The central finite curve, the most significant piece of world-building the show introduced, is explained and then destroyed in the same episode, without a dedicated setup or a separate aftermath episode to process it. This structural choice contains an argument. The show is saying through its form that the mythology is not more important than the moment-to-moment experience of the characters. The reason Rick surrendered himself to the Federation matters more than the mechanics of how the Federation operates. The reason Morty keeps going back to adventures with Rick, despite everything he has been through, matters more than the cosmological framework that makes those adventures possible. The show keeps returning to the emotional register even when it is wrapped in science fiction spectacle, and the structural marginalization of the mythology is the way it enforces that priority. The Beth duplication arc is the show's most quietly devastating extended storyline, and it tends to receive less sustained attention than the Evil Morty mythology, despite being, in many ways, the show's most formally ambitious long-form question. In the Season 3 episode titled The ABCs of Beth, Rick offers his daughter a choice he has apparently been prepared to make for a long time. She can leave. She can go on adventures of her own, pursue the life she might have had if she had made different choices. And Rick will construct a perfect clone of her to stay behind and be the mother and wife and person that this Beth is ambivalent about being. The episode is careful about what it shows you. Rick has clearly thought about this offer. He has the capability ready. He makes the offer without apparent hesitation. What this means about how Rick thinks of Beth, whether the offer is an act of generosity or an act of something more complicated, is left open. The final scenes of the episode are constructed to leave it genuinely unclear whether Beth takes the offer. And the show, in every subsequent season, maintains this ambiguity. Whether the Beth we see in seasons 4, 5, 6, and 7 is the original Beth or a clone is never definitively established within the fiction. Harmon has spoken about this in interviews, and his consistent position is that the ambiguity is structural rather than an oversight. Beth herself does not know. The clone, if there is a clone, was built to want to be there. Does wanting to be somewhere constitute authentic presence if the wanting was engineered? The show does not answer this. And it does not answer it because the show does not believe the question has a clean answer. This connects to the show's deepest and most recurring thematic concern. Rick and Morty is a show about the stability of identity under conditions of infinite replication and infinite revision. If there are infinite versions of you, making infinite choices across infinite dimensions, which one is you? If your choices can be undone and rerun, are they really choices? If your memories can be altered by someone with access to the technology, is your sense of continuous selfhood reliable? The show raises these questions through its science fiction mechanics and then lives inside them without resolving them, because resolving them would suggest they have clean answers when they do not. The ambiguity is the honest answer. The Rick-Morty relationship is the show's center of gravity, and it rewards analysis at every level of the iceberg. At the surface level, the relationship is a science fiction adventure partnership between a genius and his less capable companion. At the next level down, it is an exploration of the way a brilliant and damaged adult can pull a young person into their orbit and change them in ways that cannot be undone. At the level beneath, that it is an examination of the specific kind of love that exists between people who need each other in unequal and asymmetrical ways, but where the love is real on both sides regardless. Rick needs Morty. This is not a sentimental reading. The show establishes it mechanically. The brainwave camouflage function requires a Morty. But the show also establishes it emotionally, and the emotional establishment is harder to point at because the show embeds it in moments that are passing and understated. There is a scene in the episode titled A Wrinkle in Time, in which Rick faces a choice about self-sacrifice that he makes, and then is given what seems like a chance to take it back, and he takes it back, and then it turns out the chance was a test, and the willingness to sacrifice himself was the thing that was real. The show gives you this moment at high speed, wrapped in comedy, with the minimum possible sentimentality. Rick loves Morty. The show shows you this and moves on quickly, the way Rick would want it to. Morty needs Rick in the way that a person needs the thing that has shaped them, even when that thing is not good for them. Morty has had his world expanded beyond recovery. He has seen the universe in its actual scale and has lost the comfortable illusions that allowed him to feel safe in an ordinary life. He cannot unknow this. And the person who showed it to him is the person he goes back to, repeatedly. Because the relationship is the only container large enough to hold what he now knows about the universe. That is a kind of love. It is not a healthy love in the conventional sense. But it is specific and irreplaceable and real. The Morty's Mind Blowers episode, which airs in the 3rd season as the show's most inventive use of the clip show format, gives you the most unsettling extended picture of what the relationship actually contains. The episode reveals that Rick has a warehouse full of vials, each one containing a memory he removed from Morty and stored. The memories in the vials are adventures that never appeared in previous episodes, moments from a life Morty cannot access because the access was taken from him. The episode shows you a selection of these. Some are memories of incidents where Rick made catastrophic mistakes that hurt Morty badly. By removing the memory, Rick removes Morty's ability to hold him accountable for what happened. Some are memories of events that were traumatic for Morty independent of Rick's culpability, things Morty genuinely could not carry. Rick removed those too. The episode does not distinguish cleanly between these two categories of removal, which is the point. Rick does not have a clean internal accounting of when he is protecting Morty and when he is protecting himself. The motivations are mixed in ways that probably cannot be separated. This is one of the most honest things the show says about Rick, that his care and his self-interest are intertwined so thoroughly that he himself cannot tell you which one is primary in any given decision. What the warehouse of vials represents, if you hold it in your mind across the show's entire run, is the weight of a relationship that has been built on edited memory. Morty's trust in Rick is not uninformed. It is informed by a version of their history that Rick has curated. The warmth between them is real. It is also built on a foundation that has been carefully managed. The show does not condemn Rick for this entirely, and it does not excuse him. It just shows you what it is. We go deeper into the tier of the iceberg where fan theories and close reading analyses are the primary material. The Evil Morty is Rick's original Morty theory is the single most enduring piece of Rick and Morty fan analysis, and it has survived since the 1st season, because the show keeps providing material that is consistent with it without confirming it. The theory in its clearest form runs as follows. Rick C-137's backstory, as delivered in the Season 5 finale, involves the death of his wife and the loss of the life he had built. After this event, Rick spent years traveling across dimensions, developing and testing portal technology, searching for the person responsible. During this period of nomadic dimensional travel, the theory proposes Rick acquired a Morty as a companion, not the Morty we know. An earlier Morty, from a dimension Rick passed through during his search. This earlier Morty served the function all Mortys serve, the camouflage function, the brainwave cancellation that makes Rick harder to track. But he also served a deeper function, the companion function, the person who keeps the brilliant and increasingly unmoored man from losing himself entirely in the vastness of the search. He was with Rick during the years when Rick was becoming the thing he eventually became. He saw the pattern. He saw the way Rick treated him and other Mortys across infinite dimensions. He saw the Citadel forming around the principle of Rick's supremacy. He saw the system for what it was. And he decided to do something about it. This Morty became Evil Morty. The Season 5 finale confirms an origin for Evil Morty that is emotionally consistent with this reading without providing the specific biographical connection to Rick C-137. Evil Morty's stated motivation is the exploitation of Mortys by Ricks as a systemic problem, not a personal grievance against one specific Rick. The theory would predict more personally directed anger if Rick C-137 were the Rick who used him first. What the show gives you is something more institutional, which is either because the theory is slightly wrong in its specifics, or because Evil Morty has processed his personal history into something larger and more deliberate than personal revenge. Armin and the writers have been carefully non-committal about this theory in every interview where it has come up. This behavior pattern is consistent with several different situations. It is what a writer does when the theory is correct and they do not want to confirm it prematurely. It is also what a writer does when the theory is close but not exactly right, and confirming the difference would spoil the actual story. And it is what a writer does when the theory is genuinely undecided and the careful non-committal is honest rather than strategic. The show has not given us enough information to know which of these is the case. Evil Morty's project on the Citadel, as documented in the Ricklantis mix-up and the episodes that follow, is the show's most extended examination of what institutional power looks like and how it is used. He uses the democratic process as a tool for consolidating power rather than as an expression of the values democracy is supposed to represent. He wins a genuine election and then eliminates his supporters. He builds on the Citadel's existing structures while systematically dismantling the Ricks who ran those structures. What makes Evil Morty impossible to read as a simple villain is that his goal, the goal the Season 5 finale delivers on, is the destruction of the central finite curve. That is not a conquest. That is not an expansion of power. That is the destruction of the system itself, from inside. He achieves the thing, gains total control of the Citadel, and then destroys what he controlled. The power was the means, not the end. The central finite curve is worth extended analysis because it is the most significant conceptual contribution the show has made to its own mythology, and its implications are still unfolding. The concept is established in the Season 5 finale in a sequence that works both as plot mechanics and as a statement about the nature of what Rick has been doing all along. The curve is defined as the subset of the infinite multiverse consisting of all dimensions in which Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in the universe. The portal gun and the entire infrastructure of dimensional travel that Rick operates within are confined to this subset. Every dimension Rick can reach is a dimension where he is the most capable being by definition. He has not been exploring the infinite multiverse. He has been exploring a bounded corner of it, a corner defined by and tailored to his own supremacy. The implications are uncomfortable, and the show knows it. Every time Rick has presented himself as the most capable person in the universe, he has been correct within a universe that was specifically constructed to ensure this would be true. The freedom he presents as absolute is freedom with a ceiling. The contempt for everyone else is contempt for people who are less capable than him in every environment he has access to. But that is because the environments were selected for his advantage. The show is revealing that the entire foundation of Rick's self-concept has been constructed rather than discovered. He is the smartest person in the room, not because he is the smartest being in existence, but because he arranged his life to never have to be in a room where someone smarter would be present. Evil Morty destroys this. He eliminates the barrier of the curve and escapes into the wider multiverse. The dimensions Rick cannot reach. The places where other intelligences exceed his. The universe as it actually is, rather than the version tailored to Rick. What this means for Rick going forward is the show's most pressing open question. Rick has built every aspect of himself on the premise of his own supremacy. That premise is now untenable within his own mythology. The show has not yet fully addressed this, which is either because it is building to something, or because the implications are so large that the show is still figuring out how to follow them. Let us spend time with the characters the show has built its world around, going deeper than the surface readings usually reach. The Rick-Beth relationship is one of the most structurally significant dynamics in the show, and one that tends to receive less sustained analysis than the Rick-Morty relationship because it is less visually present across the episodes. Beth grew up without a father. Rick left at some point in her childhood, and the show never provides a clean account of when or why. What it provides are effects. Beth married Jerry, who is demonstrably beneath her in intelligence and ambition, because Jerry made her feel stable and safe. That is the choice you make when the most formative male relationship in your life was one of abandonment. You choose someone who will not leave, even if what you are choosing is also a ceiling on what you can become. Beth became a horse surgeon. She is proud of this in a way that is almost aggressive, that closes conversation rather than opening it. But horse surgery is self-evidently beneath the capabilities of someone with Rick Sanchez's genetic material and intellectual inheritance. She needed to build an identity in Rick's absence. She needed to prove her own worth without reference to him. Horse surgery was what she found. The pride is not false. But the thing she is proud of is also the thing that measures the distance between who she is and who she might have been. When Rick returns, Beth's desire for his approval is visible in nearly every scene they share, running alongside an equally visible determination not to appear to need it. She loves him and resents him and wants him to see her as extraordinary in the way he is extraordinary, and Rick, who is far more perceptive about people than he ever admits, uses this. He leverages her desire for approval to maintain his position in the household. He works against Jerry not with open hostility, but with the subtler method of making Beth doubt the foundations of her marriage, making her feel that Rick's contempt for Jerry is actually perceptive rather than strategic. The episode titled The ABCs of Beth crystallizes this dynamic by showing you what Rick actually thinks of his daughter. He tells her directly that he engineered her, not biologically, but behaviorally. He built her, through the adventures they had when she was young, into someone capable of making difficult decisions without flinching. Someone who has within her the capacity to do terrible things without the paralysis that stops most people. He is proud of this. He tells her so. And the horror of the scene is that the pride is real. Rick loves Beth. He loves her in the way that a person who used someone loves them, which is complicated and real and insufficient simultaneously. Jerry is the character who tests the show's internal logic most consistently, because the show uses him as a figure of contempt with such regularity that it would be easy to miss the cases where the show is also asking you to take him seriously. Jerry is not capable in the register of Rick's adventures. He cannot fight, cannot invent, cannot improvise under pressure. He is ordinary in every quality the show values most visibly. But the show keeps finding moments to confirm that what Jerry is capable of matters. He wants a stable family. He wants to be present for his children and his wife. He wants to love and to be loved back without condition. He wants to feel that his presence has meaning to the people around him. These are not small desires. They are foundational ones. And the show, across its seasons, keeps demonstrating that Jerry's instincts about what the family needs, even when his ability to provide it is limited, are not wrong. The episode titled The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy gives the Rick-Jerry dynamic the most extended treatment in the show's run. Rick takes Jerry on an adventure alone, without the rest of the family. They go to a resort on a planet where death is not possible. They are neither comfortable nor hostile together. They are two people who have been in each other's lives for years and who have never actually understood each other, now with nowhere to go. The climax involves a sequence in which they briefly experience each other's inner lives. The show handles this obliquely, without showing you the full content of what each sees. What we understand is that Jerry sees something in Rick that is genuinely beyond his capacity to process, something on a scale that his emotional vocabulary has no tools for. And Rick sees in Jerry something simple and full and genuine. Not impressive, not exceptional, but complete in its way. The episode does not resolve the animosity between them. It is not a reconciliation and is not presented as one. But it is a recognition, and for these two characters, recognition is the closest thing to connection that is available. Summer's arc is the show's most underutilized potential, and the Iceberg community has written about this extensively. In the early seasons, she is positioned as the teenager who wants to be included in the adventures and is kept on the periphery by Rick's preference for Morty. She is competent when the show actually gives her something to do, a fact established in the first season and periodically revisited, but her integration into the show's central dynamic remains incomplete through several seasons. Her development becomes more substantial in later seasons. She becomes more regularly involved in the adventures. The show explores her specific way of processing the knowledge that comes with being Rick's granddaughter, which is different from Morty's. Where Morty tends toward anxiety and a compulsive need for connection, Summer tends toward toughness and suppression. Her vulnerability is there, but it is maintained at a distance by a performance of invulnerability that the show occasionally lets you see through. The scene in the Rick's Must Be Crazy, where she tells Rick's ship to protect her in ways that do not make her feel bad, and the ship responds by doing terrible things invisibly, is one of the show's most precise small observations. Summer is not villainized by this. She is shown as someone who, in a moment of overwhelm, adjusts the parameters rather than questioning the premise. She has absorbed something from long proximity to Rick, the capacity to benefit from a system without examining it, in a way that the show notes without punishing. We are in the deepest layers now, where the show's philosophical commitments and its relationship to other texts become the primary subject. The show is in explicit conversation with Doctor Who, which Dan Harmon has cited as a foundational influence. The structural parallels are clear. An ancient and alien genius with a fantastical vehicle and a young human companion whose humanity keeps the genius tethered to something. The genius's relationship to time and space is one of vast perspective and occasional despair. The companion's function is anchoring, not merely assisting. The show takes this structure and removes the moral center. The Doctor's consistent humanism, his commitment to non-violence where it is available, his genuine love of humanity as a species, has been stripped from Rick entirely. What remains is the perspective, the vehicle, the companion, the despair, and the competence, all operating without the ethical framework that gave the original structure its redemptive shape. Rick is what you get when you take the Doctor and remove the thing that made the Doctor ultimately good. Douglas Adams is present throughout, in the register of comedy science fiction that takes its premises seriously enough to follow their logic into genuinely dark places while maintaining a surface warmth and irony. The running observation in Adams's work, that the universe is incomprehensibly vast and structurally indifferent to the concerns of any particular species, finds its echo throughout the show. But Rick and Morty pushes past Adams's fundamental gentleness into territory where the indifference is actively threatening rather than merely comic. Albert Camus's absurdism is the philosophical tradition the show most closely approaches without fully inhabiting. The absurdist position, articulated most directly in the myth of Sisyphus, is that the confrontation between the human need for meaning and the universe's absolute silence on this question is the fundamental condition of modern life. Camus's prescription is revolt, the act of staying in the confrontation, continuing to live and seek and connect while fully accepting that the universe will not validate the seeking. Neither suicide, which Camus identifies as surrender to the confrontation, nor religion, which he identifies as a false resolution, but the difficult and ongoing act of living with the problem. Rick cannot do revolt. He got to the confrontation, recognized it, and chose performance instead. He performs not caring because actually not caring would require a deadness he has not achieved, and revolt. The choice to care anyway would require accepting a vulnerability he cannot tolerate. Morty is the absurdist in the household. His speech from the episode 60 Minutes, in which he tells Summer that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, and that they should go watch television, is a remarkably precise expression of Camusian revolt. He has absorbed the hard knowledge about the universe and turned it into a reason for the ordinary pleasures of being alive with the people you love. Rick would never allow himself this. Morty has found it, imperfectly and incompletely, but he has found it. Friedrich Nietzsche is present in the show primarily as a target. Rick's persona, the genius who operates above conventional morality, who treats his own intelligence as license for anything, who claims to have moved past the value systems that bind ordinary people, is a parody of the Nietzschean concept of the Übermensch. What Rick has missed, and what the show documents through its consequences over many seasons, is that Nietzsche's project was not a permission for contempt. Nietzsche was interested in the responsibility and the loneliness and the creative burden of someone who refuses inherited values and must build their own. Rick has the refusal without the responsibility, the contempt without the creation, the freedom without the commitment that would make the freedom meaningful. The show argues, through Rick's alcoholism and his loneliness and the systematic destruction of every relationship that requires genuine vulnerability, that this is not a viable position. The show's engagement with physics is gestural rather than rigorous, but the gestures are informed ones. The portal gun and the infinite dimensions are drawn from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, associated primarily with the physicist Hugh Everett III, who proposed it in the late 1950s. The many worlds interpretation holds that the quantum wave function never collapses, but that every possible measurement outcome occurs in a branching universe where that outcome happened. The show uses this as a storytelling premise rather than as a scientific argument, but it uses it consistently, and the consistency creates a mythology that feels coherent even when the individual science is extrapolated well beyond what any physicist would endorse. What the many worlds premise does for the show philosophically is more interesting than what it does for the adventure plots. It externalizes the problem of identity in a way that makes the problem unavoidable. In a universe with only one version of each person, identity is stable by default. You are who you are, because there is only one version of you. In the many worlds universe, where every possible version of you exists, identity becomes a question of choice and emphasis rather than of fact. Which version of you is the real one? Which set of choices defines you? The show cannot answer this, and the characters cannot answer this, and the discomfort of living with the question is where the show's emotional territory lives. The final deep tier of the iceberg contains the questions the show has been building toward without yet answering, and the structural commitments that make those questions unavoidable. The question of what the show has been building towards since season 1 is the most honest summary of where the iceberg ends. Evil Morty is somewhere beyond the central finite curve, in the wider multiverse the show has not yet explored, whether the show follows him there, whether he returns. Whether his escape has consequences for Rick C-137 specifically, or for the multiverse generally, is genuinely unknown. The wider multiverse is populated by intelligences greater than Rick's, which means that Rick's entire self-concept is now operating in a universe where its foundational premise cannot be guaranteed. He is no longer structurally the most capable being in any place he can reach. The guarantee is gone. The Beth question remains open. Whether the Beth we see in the current seasons is the original, or a clone is maintained as genuine ambiguity. The show has not given you the answer because the answer is not the point. The point is that Beth herself does not know, and that the clone, if there is a clone, was built to want to be there, and that wanting to be somewhere that you were built to want to be in is not clearly different from wanting to be somewhere because you chose to be there. The show holds this ambiguity because it thinks the question is more interesting than either answer. The Rick origin story, as delivered in the season 5 finale, is a constructed memory presented through a device the show has used previously to deceive characters. The emotional shape of the story is coherent and consistent with everything we know about Rick from his behavior across 7 seasons. But the reliability of the specific details is left deliberately in question. The show has not told you whether the backstory you were given is the full truth, a partial truth, or a construction Rick built for the purpose of the scene. What the show has told you across all of its seasons is what Rick is, and what he does, and what it costs. Not as a biography, but as a portrait. The portrait shows a person who was broken in a specific way and built a self around the break that is both impressively functional and systematically harmful to everyone, including himself. The portrait shows that person loving people anyway, in the ways available to him, which are sometimes cruel and sometimes generous, and almost always insufficient, but never entirely absent. The show's final trick, the one at the very bottom of the iceberg, is that it keeps making you feel this by first making you believe nothing should. The nihilism is the setup. The love is the punchline. And the punchline keeps working episode after episode, season after season, because the show earns the nihilism first. It takes the void seriously. It does not paper over the indifference of the universe or the smallness of people relative to that indifference. It shows you the void, thoroughly and without flinching. And then it shows you two people in the void together, going somewhere, and it suggests that the together is not nothing. That it is, given the circumstances, quite a lot. Morty is the show's bet. Not heroic, not spectacular, not exceptional in any of the registers the show rewards most visibly. Just a kid who keeps getting back up, who keeps caring about people, who keeps trying to matter to someone in a universe that has given him every reason to stop trying, who has had his memory altered so many times that his sense of continuous selfhood should be in ruins, and who persists as recognizably himself anyway, who has been to places no ordinary person should be able to survive, and who came back from them with his capacity for connection still intact. This is the most optimistic thing the show believes about human beings. That you can be inside a system designed to use you. That you can absorb knowledge that should destroy your capacity for ordinary feeling. That you can be repeatedly traumatized and wiped and placed in danger by someone you love, and that you can still come back as someone who laughs and cares and reaches toward people. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but still yourself, still trying. Rick cannot allow himself to believe this. The tragedy of the show is that the person best positioned to understand what Morty represents, to recognize the validity of Morty's response to the universe, is also the person most constitutionally incapable of adopting it. Rick knows that the nihilism is not the answer. The show gives you enough access to what is underneath the performance to make this clear. He knows. He just cannot stop performing. One of the features of iceberg analysis that the surface level conversation tends to skip is the detailed reading of individual episodes as structured arguments, not just as plots or setups for theories. Rick and Morty is an unusually consistent show at the level of episode construction, and going through the landmark episodes with more attention than the plot summary allows reveals the show's priorities very clearly. The pilot is the obvious starting point, and the pilot rewards the most attention precisely because of what it chooses to do in its first minutes. The cold open shows you Rick at his most extreme, threatening Morty's life, apparently genuinely. Then, it reveals itself as a dream. This move is not a fake out for its own sake. It is establishing the show's relationship to its own extremity. Yes, Rick is dangerous. Yes, he does put Morty in danger. But the framing of it as a dream at the start also tells you that the show is going to use extreme scenarios as a way of exploring emotions rather than as ends in themselves. The bomb that would wipe out humanity is not actually about wiping out humanity. It is about the nature of the bond between these two people, which is intense enough that Rick's unconscious reaches for apocalyptic imagery to express it. The episode's actual plot, which involves a love potion that mutates the world's population, establishes the show's formal commitment to following its premises to their logical conclusion. Rick gives Morty the potion. It goes wrong. Rick cannot fix it cleanly. The fix creates a second mutation. The world cannot be restored. And Rick's solution is not heroic. It is lateral. He finds a universe where the problem was solved by other versions of themselves, and those other versions recently died in an unrelated accident, and he and Morty move in. The old Rick and Morty bury themselves in the backyard. This ending is one of the most formally audacious things the show does in its entire first season. The hero does not fix the problem. The hero abandons the universe where the problem lives and takes up residence in a universe where someone else fixed it, and the someone else is a version of himself who is now dead. This is Rick's solution to an unfixable problem, which is both completely logical given his capabilities and deeply permanently disturbing as a portrait of how he moves through the world. Meeseeks and Destroy, from the first season, is the episode that introduces Mr. Meeseeks and that establishes the show's capacity for horror inside comedy. Mr. Meeseeks are beings who exist only to complete a task and then cease to exist. Their existence is suffering in direct proportion to the difficulty of their assigned task. Gary's task, to improve his golf game, is the most trivial imaginable. But improving a golf game is actually quite difficult if you do not have the innate capability for it, and the Meeseeks cannot complete the task. And so they multiply. And so they suffer. And so the suffering eventually turns into violence. The Meeseeks concept is the show doing what it does best, taking a science fiction premise and using it to literalize a real observation about human experience. The Meeseeks are beings defined entirely by their function. They exist to be useful. When they cannot be useful, their existence becomes unbearable. This is a horror story about what happens when you make usefulness the entirety of your selfhood, when your identity is entirely dependent on your ability to deliver value to someone else. The show makes it explicitly terrible. And then, it gives Mr. Meeseeks a warmth that keeps you from simply reading the episode as a critique. He wants to help. The wanting is genuine. The tragedy is that the person who needs his help has a desire so vague and unresolvable that the help cannot reach it. Rick Potion number 9, which contains the Cronenberg ending discussed elsewhere in this iceberg, also contains a sequence that is worth analyzing for its own sake. Before the mutation begins, the episode is structured around Morty's desire for a girl at school and Rick's complicated feelings about providing romantic assistance. Rick agrees to make a love potion for Morty, but extracts an undertaking from him in exchange. This exchange is the episode's most uncomfortable moment, because the undertaking Rick asks for from a teenage grandson is deeply inappropriate by any conventional measure, and the show knows this, and Morty knows this. And Morty agrees anyway, because he wants the potion badly enough. The episode is using this to establish the dynamic of the Rick-Morty relationship in a way that will pay off in later seasons. Rick can ask things from Morty that no responsible adult should ask of a child. Morty can refuse, and sometimes does. But the power differential is real, and Rick knows how to leverage it. The love potion is Rick giving Morty what he wants while simultaneously extracting a price that ensures Rick is not merely being generous, but is conducting a transaction. The show does not frame this as straightforwardly bad. It frames it as complicated, as the texture of this specific relationship. But it shows you the texture clearly. 60 Minutes from the first season is structurally one of the show's most unusual episodes. Rick installs cable television that broadcasts programming from parallel universes. The family watches it. The A-plot is essentially no plot at all. Rick and Morty watching television, improvising commentary, with much of the actual dialogue in the television sequences improvised by Roiland. The B-plot involves Summer and Beth and Jerry discovering, through a machine Rick builds, that in most parallel universes they were never born, that their parents never met, that the specific convergence of circumstances that produced them was unlikely enough to have not occurred in most versions of reality. The B-plot is where the episode's philosophical content lives. Summer's response to learning that she does not exist in most universes is to pack a bag and prepare to leave, reasoning that if she was never supposed to exist, then her existence has no meaning. Morty's response, which he delivers to her in the backyard at the end of the episode, is the speech that has become one of the show's most quoted pieces of dialogue. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. And they might as well go watch television. This speech is misread as nihilism almost as often as it is read correctly. Morty is not saying that nothing matters. He is saying that the universe does not assign your meaning for you, and that the absence of assigned meaning does not mean there is no meaning. The television is not an ironic non sequitur. The television is the show. The family, watching television together, sharing the experience of something stupid and funny and real, is the meaning. Not cosmic meaning. Not the meaning the universe assigns you. The meaning you make in the present tense, with the people you love, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary life. Morty has been to places that should have destroyed his capacity for this kind of meaning. He has come back with it intact. That is the point. Autoerotic Assimilation, from Season 2, is the episode that the Iceberg community consistently identifies as the show's most personal and most formally daring. The main plot involves Rick reconnecting with Unity, a hive mind entity who was apparently his romantic partner before the events of the show. Unity is a consciousness that absorbs entire planetary populations, speaking and acting through their bodies. Rick and Unity had a relationship. They separated. Rick finds Unity occupying a planet, and the episode follows his attempt to reconnect. The episode reveals, through the course of the adventure, several things about Rick's relational patterns. He is initially charming and affectionate in the way that a person can be at the beginning of a reconciliation, when the memory of what went wrong is still being held at bay by the pleasure of reconnection. Unity is genuinely glad to see him, but Rick's presence, as the episode documents, makes Unity worse. Not dramatically worse, not in the register of obvious harm, but worse in the way that any codependent dynamic makes both parties worse. More self-destructive. More willing to indulge impulses that should be resisted, less committed to the work of being what they are trying to be. Unity leaves. The letter she writes explains this more clearly than Rick does. She loves him. But his influence on her is damaging, and she cannot be what she needs to be while he is present. This is a portrait of a relationship that is real and impossible simultaneously, where the love is genuine and the damage is also genuine, and neither the love nor the damage is fake. The episode ends with Rick alone in his garage. Unity's planet, now empty of her presence, is silent outside. Rick sits at his workbench. He constructs something. The camera does not show you clearly what it is. He holds it up. The shot is brief. It holds. And then fades. The show never addresses this scene directly again. Harmon has spoken about it in interviews and identified it as the most personally significant thing in the series for him, the scene that came closest to his own experience of a specific kind of despair. He has framed it carefully, as an honest portrayal rather than a glamorization, as a document of where someone ends up when they have systematically dismantled every connection that might sustain them. The choice not to dramatize what Rick decides in that moment, to simply cut away and let you carry the image forward, is one of the show's most formally brave decisions. Get Swifty, also from Season 2, is one of the show's most purely comic episodes and is not typically discussed in Iceberg analysis for its philosophical content. But it contains a subplot involving Summer and a cult that forms in response to the alien visitors who demand that Earth perform a song for them. That is worth noting. The cult's theology organizes itself around the alien ship, which the cultists interpret as a divine manifestation. When the ship behaves in ways that contradict their interpretations, they revise their theology rather than abandoning it. When their leader is killed, they find a way to incorporate the death into the theology. The subplot is a gentle satire of how belief systems respond to disconfirming evidence, and it is also a gentle satire of how the Rick and Morty fandom was already, by the second season, organizing itself around the show in ways that had more to do with the need for a belief system than with the content of the show itself. The cultists are not bad people. They are people who need something to organize their uncertainty around, and who have found something, and who now need the something to be more than it is. The show watches this with affection and a slight wince. The Ricks Must Be Crazy, also from Season 2, deploys the nested microverse premise that is one of the show's most carefully constructed philosophical statements. Rick built a miniature universe inside his car battery. The inhabitants of that universe are real people with real civilizations and real lives, who believe that the energy they generate serves their own purposes and are not aware that their purpose is to power Rick's car. Inside that universe, a scientist named Zeep Zanflorp has built a smaller microverse inside his own battery. And inside that universe, another scientist has built an even smaller one. The premise is about exploitation, and specifically about the ethics of creating a civilization for the purpose of extracting its energy without that civilization's knowledge or consent. Rick is disturbed by Zeep's microverse not because Zeep has done something wrong in principle, but because Zeep's microverse reduces the power output available to Rick. The moral problem is the same at every level. Rick did to his microverse inhabitants what the universe did to Rick, created them or placed them in a context that serves someone else's purposes that they are not aware of. The show does not resolve this into a lesson. It ends with Rick satisfied, Zeep complicit, and the nested exploitation intact. The episode titled Total Recall from Season 2 is built around a science fiction premise: alien parasites who reproduce by implanting false memories, that the show uses to explore something genuinely interesting about how memory and affection function together. The parasites create false relatives who seem real because the people around them have memories of them. The family has to work out a rule for identifying the real from the false, and the rule they arrive at is that real people have bad memories as well as good ones, that you can only remember genuinely painful or embarrassing or conflicted interactions with real people rather than only positive ones. This is quietly profound as an observation about intimacy. We are close to people not despite the bad memories, but partly because of them. The accumulation of imperfect experiences, of times when someone disappointed us or hurt us or showed us something we did not want to see about them or ourselves, is part of what makes a relationship real. A relationship with only positive memories is a relationship with a stranger who has been very careful with you. Real people are messy, and the mess is constitutive. The episode also plants something in its resolution that rewards attention. The family works out who is real and eliminates the parasites. But the episode ends by showing you a parasite that has been in the house the whole time, undetected. The show leaves this without resolution and does not return to it. It is either a mistake in the episode's logic, which would be unusual for this show, or it is a deliberate choice to leave the question open, to suggest that the family's confidence in having identified the real from the false is premature. Given everything the show builds around the question of which version of the family is real, this feels deliberate. The Season 2 episode titled Look Who's Purging Now is one of the less discussed episodes in the Iceberg community, but it contains a sequence that is worth noting. Rick and Morty land on a planet that has a purge holiday, an annual night when all laws are suspended and violence is permitted. This is directly inspired by the film franchise The Purge. Rick finds the premise obviously stupid and initially declines to participate. Morty becomes involved in the local politics and ends up participating in the purge with a violence that surprises both of them. The episode explores what happens when a character who is usually positioned as the moral center of an adventure discovers that he has the capacity for significant violence when sufficiently provoked. Rick's response to this revelation about Morty is interesting because it is not the moralistic response the episode might appear to be setting up. Rick does not counsel Morty against the capacity. He does not suggest that the violence was wrong. He does not ask Morty to examine what it means that he was capable of this. He notes it and moves on, and the episode ends without a lesson. The show is suggesting that the capacity for violence under sufficient provocation is not something that marks a person as fundamentally different from who they believe themselves to be. It is just a capacity that most people never test. The Season 3 premiere, already discussed for its mythology content, also contains a sequence worth analyzing for its own sake. The episode uses Rick's memory extraction as a framing device, and inside the extracted memories, Rick constructs a scenario in which he is an ordinary small-town Rick who never developed advanced technology, who stayed home, who built a life with his wife and his daughter without ever building a portal gun. The show gives you this for several minutes. A Rick who is content, who is present, who is not performing anything. It is one of the most devastating sequences in the show. Not for anything that happens in it, but for what it implies about everything outside it. The ordinary Rick is obviously the road not taken. He chose the portal gun. He chose the adventure and the genius and the flight from ordinary life. And the scene in which this is dramatized is played with a tenderness that the show almost never allows itself to sustain. The family, the simple life, the ordinary dinner. This is what Rick gave up, or this is what was taken from him, depending on how you read the backstory. The show holds the image long enough for you to feel the weight of it before it moves on. The episode titled Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender from Season 3 is the show's most extended parody of superhero adventure structure and also its most complicated statement about what heroism actually involves. The Vindicators are a team of superhero analogs who have previously worked with Rick and Morty, but who excluded them from their last adventure. Now the Vindicators need Rick again. And Rick is hostile and drunk and has apparently spent the night before the episode setting up an elaborate Saw-style death trap for the Vindicators. The death trap is designed around the specific hypocrisies and failures of each Vindicator, revealed gradually as the traps are triggered. Rick spent drunk time the night before cataloging every way the Vindicators have failed to live up to their own heroic self-presentation. Every gap between what they claim to be and what they are. The episode becomes a deconstruction of heroism as identity, as branding, as self-story. The Vindicators have organized their entire self-concepts around being heroes. Rick's traps force them to confront the evidence against that self-concept, and the confrontation destroys several of them. But the episode is not simply a celebration of Rick's demolition of heroism. The episode notes, quietly, that drunk Rick spent his night before the adventure building this elaborate trap rather than, for example, doing something useful. The energy that Rick puts into proving that heroism is fraudulent is itself a kind of compensation, a way of processing his own relationship to the concept. Rick cannot be a hero. He has foreclosed that identity for himself. But the act of disproving heroism in others keeps him in relationship to the concept without having to claim it. The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 is where Rick's treatment of Beth is examined most directly and most honestly. Rick tells Beth that he used to take her on adventures when she was young, and that in the process of those adventures, he made her into a specific kind of person. A person who can make hard decisions without flinching. A person who has within her the capacity for the kind of ruthlessness that the universe sometimes requires. He is telling her this because he has just offered her the opportunity to leave her family, and he wants her to understand that she can do it. That he built her to be able to do it. The horror of the scene is in the specifics of what Rick is confessing. He designed her. Not biologically, but behaviorally, through the experiences he chose to give her when she was a child, and he was the adult taking her on adventures. He is proud of his work. He loves her. The love and the treatment are not separate things. He treated her as a project because he loved her, and the treatment shaped her in ways she did not choose. And the result is the Beth who now sits across from him, deciding whether to abandon her children. The episode does not tell you what Beth chooses. It shows you the decision, and then it moves, which is the most honest thing it could do. Because Beth herself is not sure. And the show understands that holding the question open is the honest answer to an impossible situation. The Season 2 premiere, titled A Rickle in Time, is the episode that shows you most directly what Rick is willing to sacrifice, and under what conditions. The episode follows the consequences of the time freeze that ended Season 1. Rick froze time to allow a house party to continue indefinitely, and now the freeze has to be reversed. And the reversal creates a fracturing of reality that multiplies Rick and Morty and Summer into parallel versions of themselves, each in a slightly different timeline, the timelines diverging with every decision they make. The episode uses the fractured timeline as a visual representation of consequence. Every choice you make creates a version of reality that did not exist before. The episode makes this literal and then forces the characters to navigate it. Rick's solution is technically demanding and requires everyone to behave in perfect synchronization, which is, in practice, impossible, because Summer and Morty are teenagers who are frightened and not in sync with anything. The episode's climax involves Rick in a situation where his collar, the device keeping him anchored in time, is at risk. A choice presents itself. He can sacrifice himself to ensure that Morty and Summer are safe, or he can take action that prioritizes his own survival at their expense. Rick does not hesitate. He makes the sacrifice. He is apparently lost. And then, a being from outside normal time arrives and offers him a way back, contingent on his willingness to pay a price. Rick accepts. Then he reverses the acceptance. The being reveals that the willingness was the test, that the price does not need to be paid, that the genuine willingness to pay it was sufficient. Rick is returned. What the episode shows you in this sequence is not a heroic Rick. It is a Rick who is capable of the sacrifice, who has the capacity for it, who makes the choice without apparent agonizing. And then, it complicates this by showing you Rick's reaction afterward. He insists that the sacrifice was not emotional, that it was practical, that he was protecting an asset. The show does not stop to tell you which version is the truth. You have just watched him choose sacrifice. You are watching him insist it was not what it was. Both are visible simultaneously. The episode titled Lawn Mower Dog from the first season is where the show first fully demonstrates its capacity for horror within a comedy episode. Rick gives Morty's dog Snuffles a device that increases his intelligence, intended to make the dog more obedient. This does not work in the way intended. Snuffles' intelligence increases rapidly and continuously, and he begins to communicate and reason and eventually to organize. The episode follows two parallel plots: Rick and Morty in the dream realm of Morty's teacher, using dreams to influence the teacher's waking behavior, and Snuffles building a movement and then an infrastructure and then a civilization of enhanced dogs who have reversed the human-dog power relationship. The dog civilization plot is the episode's formal achievement. It is not played as pure comedy, though it contains comedy. The image of the enhanced dogs in their mechanized suits, looking down at humans who are now the pets, is uncomfortable. The show is pointing at something about the arbitrariness of the species hierarchy that we inhabit without thinking about it. Snuffles is not wrong. The humans kept him in a specific role because of power, not because of right. His civilization is an inversion of an unjust arrangement, and the episode does not resolve this by simply destroying his civilization and restoring the original order. It resolves it by allowing Snuffles to make a choice, to recognize what would be lost in the inversion, and to choose something more difficult than victory. He takes his enhanced dogs through a portal to a planet where they can live without the humans they resemble, where the relationship can be left behind rather than inverted. This resolution is not a defeat of the enhanced dogs. It is a choice, a more interesting resolution than either simple outcome. The episode Something Ricked This Way Comes, from Season 1, is built around a classic Faustian bargain premise filtered through the show's specific sensibility. The devil opens a cursed antique shop in the neighborhood, selling items that come with a curse attached. Summer takes a job there. Rick constructs a curse removal service in direct competition. The main plot concerns a competition between Rick and the devil that the show resolves in a way that is tonally typical and narratively satisfying. Rick wins, the devil is humiliated. The episode ends with a sequence that operates as pure adolescent fantasy. The episode is most interesting at the level of what it says about curses. The devil's curses are each attached to an item that grants something genuinely desirable, and the curse is always a consequence that is disproportionate to the benefit. A microscope that shows you everything too clearly. A business that succeeds at someone else's expense. The curse format is the show doing what it does with its science fiction premises, using the genre convention to make an observation about the real. Every significant gain in life comes with a cost that the getting obscures. The curse is just an honest accounting. The Season 2 episode titled Morty Night Run is the episode where Rick leaves Jerry in a daycare facility designed specifically to occupy Jerry's from multiple dimensions, while Rick and Morty go on an adventure. The daycare subplot is pure comedy. Jerry surrounded by other Jerrys and finding in them both recognition and horror. The horror of seeing your own worst qualities reflected back from outside. The daycare is a thought experiment about what it would be like to encounter infinite versions of yourself and to discover that most of them are exactly like you. The main plot of the episode involves a gaseous being named Fart, who Rick intended to sell to a buyer and who Morty becomes attached to and rescues. Morty and Fart attempt to get Fart to safety. Fart communicates telepathically, and what it communicates about the universe and about the nature of consciousness is genuinely striking. Fart describes its perspective on carbon-based life with something between affection and pity, seeing the carbon life forms as limited, as temporary, as less than what consciousness can be in other forms. The episode ends with Morty making a choice that costs him something real. He has come to care about Fart genuinely. And then he discovers what Fart intends to do with its freedom, and he makes the only choice the evidence supports, and the choice costs him. Because he cares. And the caring was real, even though it led to this. This is the show at a recurring formal move. It gives Morty a genuine connection, and then shows what genuine connection requires of him. Rest and Relaxation, the 6th episode of the 3rd season, is one of the show's most psychologically precise episodes, and one that the Iceberg community has given significant attention. Rick and Morty use a detoxification device after a particularly extreme adventure, and the device separates each of them into their healthy and toxic components, leaving the healthy versions of them living in the real world while their toxic selves are imprisoned in a separate dimension. The episode's central observation is about what unhealthy elements of a self actually are. Morty's toxic version is revealed to be the part of him that is self-confident, assertive, charming, ambitious, willing to pursue what he wants without excessive anxiety or consideration for others. This is presented as the toxic Morty because, in the context of a person whose core qualities are empathy and consideration, the absence of those qualities is genuinely damaging. But the episode is careful to show you that the toxic Morty is also, in a purely functional sense, more effective in the world. He is more successful socially. He is more successful professionally. The world rewards the qualities that the detoxification labeled as toxic. Rick's toxic version is the opposite in structure, but the same in logic. The healthy Rick is depressed, passive, unable to motivate himself, unable to function. The toxic Rick is the aggressive, grandiose, alcoholic, high-functioning disaster that we know from the rest of the show. Rick's dysfunction, the episode argues, is what keeps him operational. His damage is what drives him. Take it away, and what remains is a Rick who cannot do anything. The reunion of each character with their toxic half is the episode's most interesting moment. Morty's reunion is uncomfortable because the healthy Morty has to reintegrate qualities he found it a relief to be without, qualities that are genuinely difficult and unpleasant to carry. Rick's reunion is different in character. Healthy Rick does not want to be reunited with his toxic self. He knows what the reunion means. But the alternative is a life he cannot live. A life of passive unhappiness rather than active damage. He chooses the damage because the damage is, in a specific and horrible way, what he is. The episode does not moralize about this. It does not tell you what the right answer is. It shows you the choice each character makes and moves on. The episode titled A Wrinkle in Time has been discussed for Rick's sacrifice. The broader Season 2 episode landscape includes the interdimensional cable episode titled Morty's Mind Blowers, which is the show's second extended use of the interdimensional cable format and its most successful deployment of that format as a vehicle for pure comedy. The format allows the show to present a succession of extremely brief, extremely specific comedy ideas without the connective tissue of a plot, trusting each idea to land on its own. The success rate of the individual sketches across the 2 cable episodes varies, but the best of them demonstrate the show's capacity for conceptual comedy that operates at a different register from its narrative work. The episode titled Interdimensional Cable 2, more formally titled Morty's Mind Blowers, is separate from the memory clip show also called Morty's Mind Blowers. These are different episodes, and the naming creates occasional confusion in Iceberg discussion. The cable episode uses the infinite channel format. The memory clip episode uses the vial storage format. Both are formally experimental. Both abandon the show's usual narrative structure. Both work differently from any other episode type the show uses regularly. The episode from Season 3 titled The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy has been discussed in the context of the Rick-Jerry relationship, but the episode's treatment of Jerry deserves more attention than a summary gives it. The episode is named for the resort the episode takes place on, a resort where death is impossible by design. And the impossibility of death on the resort creates a specific psychological environment. Jerry, in a place where the worst possible outcome is not possible, is more fully himself than he usually gets to be. He is not performing competence he does not have, not managing the anxiety of inadequacy in Rick's presence. The resort's guarantee removes the stakes, and in the absence of stakes, Jerry is recognizably a complete person. This is the episode's observation about what anxiety does to character. Under the pressure of possible failure, possible humiliation, possible death, Jerry contracts into the worst version of himself. Given safety, he expands into something more interesting. The episode does not make this a lesson about how Jerry should be treated. It simply shows you the before and after and lets you draw the conclusion. Rick, who has never in his life been in an environment where failure was safe, who has operated at the frontier of possible catastrophe for decades, has contracted in the opposite direction. He has expanded into capability and contracted out of softness. The resort makes Jerry more. It makes Rick less, briefly, and the episode uses Rick's discomfort at the resort as its own form of observation. The show's treatment of death across its run is worth spending time on in the Iceberg. Death in Rick and Morty is not treated the way death is typically treated in animated comedy. The show does not use death as pure punctuation, as a joke with no weight. It also does not treat death as a dramatic event requiring extended mourning. It finds a middle register that is specific to what the show is doing. When characters die in the show and stay dead, the deaths carry weight in proportion to the attachment you have developed to the character. The Season 2 finale's central death has weight because the show has spent time with Bird Person and because Rick's relationship to him has been established as long-standing and real. The death is not elaborated on in the moment, but it lands. When the show uses death as a running device, specifically the ease with which Rick and Morty move between dimensions, meaning that versions of characters who die in one dimension continue to exist in others, the show keeps tracking the cost of this. The first season episode that ends with Rick and Morty burying themselves in the backyard is the show's most direct confrontation with this cost. The ability to move on is not the same as the death not happening. The death happened. The universe where it happened continues. The Rick and Morty who moved on are different from the ones who died, and they know it, and the show does not let them entirely forget it. The episode titled Something Ricked This Way Comes, and the episode titled Me Seeks and Destroy, and the episode titled Lawnmower Dog together constitute the first season establishing its formal vocabulary for what comedy and horror can do in the same space. Each of these episodes uses the premise of a science fiction or fantasy concept to locate an observation about real human experience, the arbitrariness of power, the terror of purpose without fulfillment, the injustice of hierarchies that we accept without examining. The comedy is the vehicle. The observation is the cargo. The Season 1 episode titled Rixie Business, which serves as the season finale, is an episode the Iceberg tends to overlook in favor of the mythology-heavy episodes that followed it, but as a piece of character writing it is extremely good. The episode is structured around a party that Morty and Summer throw, while Rick and Beth and Jerry go to a formal event. The two plots mirror each other, the party at the house, and the formal Bird Person encounter at the venue. The episode gives you Rick in two modes simultaneously. Rick comfortable in his own domain, presiding over a chaos he created and controls. And Rick in the early stages of what will become one of the show's most significant backstory revelations, the first glimpse of the life before. Bird Person's appearance in this episode is the first time the show establishes that Rick had a life before. He had people. He had history with someone. He had a past that made him what he is, and the past was not simply intellectual achievement. It was relationship and loss and a specific kind of personal history that the episode gestures toward without revealing. The party episode is where the mythology of Rick's past begins. Quietly, in a finale that looked like pure comedy. The show's use of the Smith family as a unit, as the organism the adventures keep returning to, is worth examining as a structural device. The family functions as the show's moral center not because any of its members are morally admirable, but because the relationships within it are the testing ground for everything the show believes about love and damage and persistence. Rick's love for Beth is real and complicated and expressed through control and through the occasional moment of genuine tenderness that he immediately undercuts. Beth's love for her children is real and expressed through a performance of competence that sometimes prevents genuine connection. Jerry's love for Beth is real and expressed through a neediness that sometimes drives her away. Morty's love for Rick is real and expressed through a capacity for forgiveness that is more than Rick deserves and that Rick probably knows he does not deserve. Summer holds the family together from an unexpected position. She is the one who keeps asking what is actually happening, who keeps not accepting the official version of events, who keeps noticing the thing that everyone else is pretending not to notice. Her function in the family is the function of the person who says what the room is not saying. It makes her uncomfortable to live with. It is also what keeps the family honest in the moments when honesty is available. The show's seasons 4, 5, 6, and 7, taken together, form a phase of the show that is distinct from the first 3 seasons in its relationship to its own mythology. The first 3 seasons built the mythology almost casually, embedding it in episodes that were primarily doing something else. Seasons 4 through 7 have known that the mythology is there, and the relationship to it changes when you know rather than when you are still discovering. The show has had to find ways to continue building while acknowledging the weight of what it has already built. This has produced some of the show's most formally inventive work and some of its most uneven. The season 6 episode titled Rick Mort, in which dinosaurs return to Earth after millions of years of absence and are revealed to be perfect, genuinely good beings who have achieved a state of effortless moral and practical excellence, is one of the show's most interesting experiments in the post-mythology phase. The episode uses the dinosaurs as a device to examine Rick's response to beings who are simply and straightforwardly better than him in the ways he most values. Rick cannot compete with the dinosaurs on intelligence, on practicality, on moral quality. They are everything he aspires to be in his functional mode and everything he has failed to become in his personal mode. Rick's response is predictable, and the episode honors the predictability by making it the engine of the plot. He has to sabotage them because he cannot tolerate their superiority. And the sabotage produces the consequences the sabotage always produces. The episode ends with the dinosaurs leaving Earth by choice rather than by defeat, taking with them the brief experience of what it would be like to live in a world genuinely organized around competence and care rather than around power and self-interest. Their departure is melancholy in a way that the show plays quietly and lets you feel. The season 7 episode titled Unmortrican brings Evil Morty back into the main narrative for the first time since his departure through the curve, and the return is handled with the care that the character's long absence demands. The episode does not rush to explain what Evil Morty has been doing or what the wider multiverse outside the curve looks like. It uses Evil Morty's return as an occasion for the Rick-Morty relationship to confront something it has been circling for the entire series. The question of whether Rick's version of love, the protective and also exploitative version, is distinguishable from Evil Morty's version, the clear-eyed and also exploitative version. Evil Morty and Rick are, in this episode, in an alliance of convenience. The episode is careful to show you that the alliance is not based on trust or affection, but on temporary alignment of goals. And it is equally careful to show you what Rick does when the alignment ends, which is to reassert the dynamic he is most comfortable with, the dynamic in which he is in control, and Morty is the companion rather than the equal. Evil Morty's response to this reassertion is the episode's most pointed moment. He is not surprised. He is not hurt. He has been expecting this and has prepared for it. Rick is legible to Evil Morty in a way that suggests Evil Morty has spent a very long time understanding Rick, which is either because he has been watching from outside the curve or because he has always known Rick from the inside. The episode ends without a clean resolution of the mythological questions it raises. Evil Morty departs again. The wider multiverse remains unexplored. The implications of what Rick has learned about his own origin, reinforced and complicated by the encounter, are not processed within the episode. The show returns to baseline and the iceberg goes deeper still, holding these questions for whatever comes next. The show's comedy philosophy is worth making explicit because the iceberg analysis of Rick and Morty tends to focus on the dramatic and philosophical content at the expense of examining what makes the comedy work at the level of craft. The show is, at its core, very funny, and the funniness is not incidental to what it is trying to do. The comedy is the mechanism that makes the harder material bearable, and the harder material is what gives the comedy its specific weight. Rick and Morty uses several comedic modes simultaneously. There is the conceptual comedy of the science fiction premise, the comedy that comes from following the logic of an absurd idea to its conclusion. If you had a device that could make anyone do anything you wanted, the thing you would most immediately want to do with it is something so small and so embarrassing that the device's power is rendered absurd by the request. There is the character comedy that comes from Rick and Morty's specific dynamic. The comedy of a supremely capable person being driven slowly to the edge of his patience by his entirely ordinary companions' entirely ordinary concerns. There is the dark comedy that comes from the show's willingness to place its characters in situations where the only available response is laughter, because the alternative responses are too large to process in the moment. The tonal control that allows all three modes to coexist without canceling each other out is the show's most underappreciated technical achievement. The episode titled Pickle Rick demonstrates this with unusual clarity. The premise is pure high-concept comedy. A man turns himself into a pickle to avoid therapy. The middle section is an action movie parody. Rick constructing functionality from rap parts while fighting through a building. The therapy scene at the end is written with complete dramatic seriousness. The episode moves through all three registers in sequence without breaking the internal logic of any of them. The comedy of the premise does not undermine the seriousness of the therapy scene. The seriousness of the therapy scene does not retrospectively make the comedy of the pickle premise feel out of place. The episode earns the movement between modes, because each mode is executed at the highest available level. This tonal mobility is what separates the show's best episodes from its weaker ones. The episodes that receive more mixed responses tend to be episodes where the tonal movement is less controlled, where the comedy and the darkness are not in productive dialogue but are simply alternating without building on each other. The comedy isolates, and the darkness isolates, and neither benefits from the other's presence. The best episodes are the ones where the comedy and the darkness are made of each other, where you cannot quite separate them. The episode titled The Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender is worth extended examination beyond what has been covered, because it does something formally unusual that the show has not done quite the same way elsewhere. The episode is explicitly constructed as a superhero genre exercise, with the Vindicators as the superhero team and their adventure as a genre piece. The show deploys every superhero convention it needs to set up the trap. Then it springs the trap, and the genre exercise becomes something else. What Rick has done with the Saw-style death traps is a form of criticism so concentrated it became sadistic. He has spent his time, in the state of deepest drunkenness, cataloging the failures of the people he is about to expose. The cataloging is the most honest thing Rick does in the episode, because it is Rick finally saying what he thinks, without the social management that usually accompanies his assessment of people. He thinks the heroes are frauds. He has always thought this. The death trap is the expression of what he thinks when there is nothing standing between thought and action. The episode then complicates this by revealing that Rick does not remember building the traps. He was blackout drunk. The Rick doing the critical cataloging and engineering the exposure of heroic fraud was a Rick operating below the level of conscious memory. What this means is that Rick's contempt for the Vindicators, his assessment of their failures, and his desire to expose them, is something that exists in him at a level deeper than the conscious Rick that presents himself as indifferent. He cares enough about the fraud of heroism to spend a night engineering its exposure. The indifference is the performance. The contempt is real. The episode's ending, which involves the last surviving Vindicator and a final confrontation with what the traps revealed, is one of the show's most effective sequences of moral ambiguity. The survivor makes a choice about whether to complete the trap's final task. The choice they make is not clean. The show does not tell you whether the choice was right. It shows you the choice and cuts away, as it always cuts away from the moments that would require it to pass judgment. The question of what the show is building toward, as a matter of narrative destination rather than thematic inquiry, is the iceberg's most practically uncertain element. The show has renewed for further seasons and has made statements about having planned content in mind. It has shown you evil Morty in the wider multiverse in the Season 7 episode, and suggested that the wider multiverse is a new territory the show is preparing to explore. It has developed Rick's character across 7 seasons to a point where the mythology questions outstanding have a specific shape. The question of what Rick is when he is not the smartest person in the room is a question the wider multiverse makes unavoidable. The show's formal commitments suggest certain things about how these questions might be handled. The show has consistently refused clean resolutions. It has consistently embedded its most significant mythology moments in episodes that were primarily doing something else. It has consistently made the emotional register more important than the cosmological one. Whatever the wider multiverse contains, whatever evil Morty is doing there. Whatever Rick encounters when he is no longer guaranteed supremacy, the show's form predicts that these developments will be handled through the same method, embedded in adventures, emotionally specific, refusing easy resolution, always returning to the family. The family is the constant. In a show about infinite dimensions and the erasability of consequence and the replicability of any particular version of anything, the Smith family household is the one thing the show keeps returning to. The kitchen table, the garage lab, the couch, the ordinary space where extraordinary people live with the ordinary weight of being ordinary as well as extraordinary, of having feelings that do not scale to the size of the universe they can access, of caring about people in a universe that has given them every reason to stop caring. The Iceberg begins at the surface with a show about a genius grandfather and his teenage companion going on science fiction adventures. It descends through production history and character analysis and fan theory and philosophical context and season-by-season mythology. At the bottom, it finds a show about whether people who have been genuinely hurt can find their way back to caring about other people. Not as a recovery narrative, not as a therapeutic arc, but as an ongoing and unresolved and human question that the show keeps asking in every episode, in every season, with every version of every character, without ever suggesting that the answer is simple, or fixed, or final. The answer is that they keep going. Rick and Morty and Beth and Jerry and Summer keeping going in the face of everything the universe has shown them about what the universe is. The going is the answer. The going is the whole iceberg. Season 4 arrived in November of 2019, after what felt by then like a characteristic gap. The season was split into 2 halves, the first 5 episodes airing in the fall of 2019, and the back 5 in the spring of 2020. This split season release structure was unusual for the show, and contributed to the sense that Season 4 was a transitional season, one that was feeling out what the show was after the cultural upheaval of the Shequan incident and the internal turbulence of Season 3. The Season 4 premiere, titled Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die, Rick Pete, does something formally interesting that the show's reputation does not always get credit for. The episode kills Rick in the cold open, and then spends the rest of its running time following Morty alone, while Rick cycles through a series of disposable clone bodies, each one placing him in a parallel dimension that he has to escape. Meanwhile, Morty, without Rick's supervision, follows a death crystal that shows him the best path to die in the arms of a girl he has a crush on, the crystal guiding his actions by showing him the outcome of each choice. The episode uses the death crystal as a device to examine what happens when Morty is given access to a version of Rick's certainty, when the anxiety that drives most of his decision-making is replaced by a clear optimizing signal? The answer is not reassuring. Morty, freed from the uncertainty that makes him considerate and empathetic, becomes increasingly ruthless in his optimization. He does things he would not otherwise do. He hurts people he would not otherwise hurt, because the crystal shows him the outcome and the outcome justifies it. This is the episode as a critique of consequentialist reasoning, the idea that the rightness of an action can be determined by its outcomes. Morty is pursuing the best outcome according to the crystal's calculations, and the pursuit requires actions that are wrong by any other measure. The episode does not resolve this with a clean lesson. It is resolved by Rick returning and the adventure ending, but the image of Morty becoming something harder and more effective and less human in the service of an outcome he has decided to want stays with you. The episode titled One Crew Over the Crew-Coo's Morty from the same season is the show's most extended meta-commentary on its own audience's relationship to narrative prediction. The episode is about heist movies, and specifically about the culture of predicting heist movie twists, and it ends with the revelation that the entire episode was Rick's plan to destroy Morty's interest in writing a heist movie by exposing him to such an elaborate series of nested twists that the concept becomes exhausted. The episode is funny, and it is also a statement about a particular mode of watching television that the show had observed developing in its audience. The viewer who watches primarily to predict, who treats the enjoyment of a story as the experience of being surprised by a twist they did not anticipate, has turned watching into a competition rather than an experience. Rick's meta-heist destroys the possibility of enjoyment for Morty by eliminating the category of surprise. If every twist is anticipated, there is no surprise. If the anticipation is the experience, there is no experience left when the surprise is gone. The episode is the show commenting on itself and on the culture that had grown up around it, gently but unmistakably. It is not hostile to the audience. It is observing something the audience had done with the show and suggesting that this thing might not be the best way to engage with something you love. The Vat of Acid episode, from Season 4, is one of the show's most formally cruel demonstrations of Rick's pedagogy. In that episode, Rick builds an elaborate, fake death escape scenario for Morty. One that allows Morty to effectively reset choices and live them over, and then uses the device to expose what Morty does when consequence is removed. There is an additional layer worth noting here, beyond the cruelty of the lesson itself, which is the episode's relationship to Rick's teaching method across the series. Rick teaches Morty regularly. He has been doing it since the pilot. The methods range from practical demonstration to dangerous immersion to the kind of extended lesson that the Vat of Acid represents. What the Iceberg community has mapped across these teaching moments is a pattern that suggests Rick's pedagogy is itself a form of care expressed through the register of control. Rick cannot tell Morty that he loves him directly. He cannot offer emotional support in the conventional sense. What he can do is teach. And teaching is the form that his investment in Morty's development takes. The brutality of the Vat of Acid lesson is not evidence that Rick does not care about Morty's development. It may be evidence that he cares about it more than the lesson's cruelty suggests, that the extremity of the method reflects the intensity of the investment. This reading does not excuse the method. It contextualizes it within a character for whom teaching is the closest available form of love. The Season 4 episode titled Childrick of Mort is one of the show's most unusual in structural terms. It follows two separate adventures simultaneously, Rick and Beth going to rescue children from an alien planet where Rick apparently accidentally fathered a large number of offspring, and Jerry and Summer and Morty getting stranded on a planet and having to learn to survive. The episode intercuts between these two adventures in a way that highlights the parallels and differences between Rick and Jerry's approaches to the same fundamental challenge. Rick's approach to the alien children is to organize them efficiently into a functional society, using his intelligence and his contempt for inefficiency to optimize their development at a speed no ordinary person could achieve. Jerry's approach to survival is slower, less efficient, more organic. He teaches Summer and Morty what he knows, which is not much, but he teaches it with patience and presence. The episode is not simply saying that Jerry is better than Rick. It is noting that the two approaches produce different things. Rick's efficiency produces a functional civilization in hours. Jerry's patience produces a connection that was not there before. The Season 4 finale, titled Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry, is one of the most formally dense episodes in the show's run. It wraps up several ongoing threads simultaneously, including the Beth clone question, which receives its most direct non-answer in this episode. It also involves the return of the Galactic Federation, a battle around the Smith House, and the re-establishment of the family dynamic after several seasons of fragmentation. The episode is most notable for the moment when Rick and both versions of Beth are in the same space, and the show very deliberately refuses to tell you which one is the original. The two Beths behave identically. They have the same memories, the same affections, the same claims on Rick's attention. The episode ends with one of them going on adventures with Rick, and one of them staying with the family. The show will not tell you which is which. The choice is left to the viewer, and the choice reveals something about what the viewer thinks identity means more than anything the show could tell you directly. Season 5 is where the show completes its longest-running mythology arc, and it does so across 2 episodes at the season's end that are among the most information-dense pieces of television the show has produced. The season progresses through several episodes that are setting up the finale without announcing themselves as setup. Mortiplicity, the season's second episode, is a bottle episode built entirely around a conceit. Rick has created so many decoy families to protect the actual family that the decoys have developed their own decoys, and nobody can tell who is the real family anymore. The episode is funny and bleak and works as a standalone adventure, but it is also the show doing in miniature what the Beth duplication arc has been doing in macro. The question of which version is the real one is rendered impossible to answer by proliferation. The Season 5 episode, titled Rick-Dependent Spray, is one of the show's most deliberately transgressive and least thematically rich episodes, designed primarily to be extreme rather than meaningful. It is worth noting in the Iceberg because it represents a mode of episode the show returns to periodically, a mode that sacrifices thematic coherence for shock value. And the Iceberg community's relationship to these episodes tends to be uncomfortable, recognizing that they are the show doing something the show is capable of doing, but that is not the show at its most interesting. The episode titled A Mortican Grickfitty from the same season is more interesting at the level of theme than it initially appears. Rick and Beth go on an adventure together while Jerry is left in charge of entertaining a teenage couple who are Summer's friends. The plot of the Rick-Beth adventure involves Rick using Jerry's suffering as a form of currency with some demons, since Jerry's suffering is apparently supremely valuable as a commodity. Rick is literally monetizing Jerry's misery. The episode holds this as comedy for most of its runtime, and then delivers a moment that slightly undercuts the comedy. The demons are not simply villains. They are connoisseurs of a specific experience, which is the suffering of someone who is fundamentally decent but perpetually unfortunate. Jerry's suffering is valuable to them because it is the purest form of undeserved hardship, the suffering of a person who means well and is continuously failed by a universe that does not reward good intentions. The episode notes, briefly and without dwelling on it, that this is what Rick has been doing with Jerry for years. Not with demons as the customer, but in the sense of treating Jerry's misery as something that generates value for Rick. Value in the form of contrast, of comparison, of the definition by opposition that Rick's superiority requires. The Season 5 finale, titled Rick Morai Jack and Forgetting Sarek Mortshall, is the mythology payload the show had been building toward since the first season. The 2-episode finale delivers Rick's origin story, the details of Evil Morty's plan, the concept of the central finite curve, and its destruction, in a sequence that is simultaneously the show's most ambitious piece of serialized storytelling and its most formal tribute to the action-adventure genre. The origin story sequence is visually beautiful in a way that is unusual for the show. The animation style shifts to suggest memory and distance, the domestic life of Rick Sanchez, before he became the Rick Sanchez of the present, is rendered with a softness and warmth that contrast sharply with the show's usual visual register. We see Diane. We see the young Beth. We see Rick refusing the stranger's offer to build portal technology together. We see the aftermath. The show refuses to give you the stranger's identity with complete clarity. This is one of the most significant decisions in the sequence. The identity of the Rick responsible for Diane's death is the show's longest-running unresolved question, and the finale answers it only obliquely. The suggestion is that Rick himself is responsible, in a specific and complicated sense that involves the inevitability of the cycle that any Rick who develops portal technology will eventually have built the weapon that killed Diane. That the causality loops in a way that makes the answer something other than a simple identification of a perpetrator. The show has been building to this question since the first season, and it chooses, at the moment of confrontation, to answer it with more complexity rather than less. Evil Morty's revelation of the central finite curve and his destruction of it has been analyzed at length. What is worth adding here, in the context of the Season 5 finale, is the scale of the visual achievement the show commits to. The curve's destruction is rendered as an enormous and disorienting cosmic event, and Evil Morty's departure through the barrier is played with complete seriousness. He is not dramatizing his own departure. He is leaving. The portal through which he exits is a door into something the show has never shown you and has not yet shown you since. The outside of the curve is a genuine unknown within the show's mythology, and the finale honors that unknown by not trying to preview it. Season 6 arrived in September of 2022 in a changed landscape both for the show and for the broader culture around it. The season attempted something the show had occasionally resisted doing before: a sustained, serialized arc that ran through multiple consecutive episodes rather than being embedded in standalone adventures. The serialization of Season 6 begins with the premiere, titled Solarix, which picks up in the immediate aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction. Rick and Morty are stranded in a dimensionally unstable environment and have to reset their portal guns. The reset causes Rick to be briefly returned to his universe of origin, Dimension C-137, which is the Cronenberg dimension that Rick abandoned at the end of the first season episode Rick Potion number 9. The brief return to C-137 is one of the most disorienting sequences the show has produced, because you are seeing Rick in a version of the world he chose to leave behind, seeing him briefly as the Rick that world would have kept, before the reset pulls him back. The episode then follows the separate adventures of Rick, Morty, and Jerry. Each return to their original dimensions by the reset, none in the same place. The separation allows the show to examine each character independently for an extended period, which is less common in the show's structure than the Rick-Morty pairing. Jerry, in his original dimension, is shown the life he might have had without Rick's influence and without Beth. The episode is careful not to make this life obviously inferior to the one he has. It is different. The Jerry who might have been is shown with sympathy and without contempt. The Season 6 episode titled Analyze Piss is, on the surface, a parody of superhero villain dynamics, with Rick encountering a villain whose power is to make everything worse in a petty and juvenile way. The episode escalates through several increasingly absurd villain encounters, and then pivots to something more serious when one of the villains targets someone Rick cares about. The emotional payload of the episode is in the second half, where the show examines what Rick does when someone uses vulnerability against him. Specifically, Morty's vulnerability. Rick's response to the threat is disproportionate in the way that all of Rick's emotional responses are disproportionate, scaled to a level that makes them visible to the audience even when they are being carefully hidden from the characters. The episode does not underline this, but the disproportionality is there, and the Iceberg community has marked it. Season 6's Night Family episode introduces the concept of Rick programming sleep versions of the family to perform tasks during the night, creating a parallel domestic arrangement that the family discovers and resents. The episode plays as a comedy, but touches on the question of consent and of the management of the family that Rick conducts largely without their awareness. The sleep family is an extreme version of a pattern the show has documented consistently. Rick organizes the domestic environment to serve his own needs while presenting the organization as being for everyone's benefit. The family, when they discover the night arrangement, rebel against it. Rick's response is to treat their rebellion as evidence of irrationality rather than of a legitimate grievance. The episode's resolution, which involves a negotiation between the family's preferences and Rick's practicality, is one of the most realistic small-scale conflict resolutions in the show, because neither side wins entirely and neither side is entirely wrong. Rick's Night family was practical and produced real benefits. The family's objection to it was also real. The negotiated outcome honors both without pretending that the underlying dynamic has changed. Season 7, with its recasting and its continuation under changed circumstances, is still in the process of being assessed by the Iceberg community. The season made a deliberate effort to engage with questions that Season 6's serialization had raised, and to develop character arcs that had been underway across the previous seasons. The episodes generally received positive responses from viewers who had accepted the recasting, and the show demonstrated that its structural DNA, its episode construction, and its thematic commitments had survived the change intact. The Season 7 episode titled That's a Morte is built around a premise involving a pasta dish made from human beings, which the show uses as a vehicle for examining the same questions about exploitation and consumption and complicity that it has examined through the Citadel and through Rick's microverse civilization. The specificity of the episode, the fact that it chooses food as the subject rather than a more abstract exploitation system, is part of its effectiveness. The horror of the episode's premise is that it makes literal a form of consumption that the show suggests is not metaphorically unlike other forms of consumption the audience participates in without examining. The Season 7 episode titled Rise of the Numbericons faces the question of what the show does with its science fiction premises when those premises are pushed to a level of abstraction that the emotional register cannot quite follow. The episode is formally inventive, but receives more mixed responses than the season's other high points, in part because the abstraction of the central premise makes it harder to locate the emotional stakes that the show usually makes visible even in its most conceptually complex episodes. The Season 7 finale, titled Fear No Mort, is an episode that the Iceberg community has analyzed extensively for its handling of Rick's fear, and specifically for what it reveals about the things Rick is afraid of. The episode involves a fear simulation device that traps the user in their deepest fear, and Rick's experience of the device is the episode's emotional center. What Rick is afraid of, the content of his deepest fear, is handled with care and with the obliqueness that the show has always used for its most direct emotional content. The fear is real. The show shows you it. And then, the episode moves on, as the show always moves on, because the looking is the thing. The prolonging of the looking is what Rick would not allow. The show's supporting characters are among its most carefully constructed elements, and the Iceberg analysis of the show has consistently been more interested in the principles than in the ensemble. But the ensemble rewards attention, because the show uses supporting characters to externalize questions that the main characters are not in a position to ask about themselves. Bird Person is Rick's oldest friend, and the character functions as the primary evidence that Rick had a life before the events of the show. Before he became the Rick of the present, Rick had relationships. He had a best friend. The friendship with Bird Person is presented as deep and long-standing, and the episode that serves as Bird Person's extended spotlight, the Season 2 episode Get Swifty, gives us the first extended look at what Rick looks like in a friendship that was built before the persona was fully calcified. Bird Person knows Rick differently from anyone else in the show. He knew the Rick who was not yet performing quite so hard, who had not yet built quite such an impenetrable wall. The statement Bird Person makes about Rick, that Rick's seeming indifference is in fact deep feeling expressed through a specific filter, is the statement the show itself is making about the character. And hearing it from someone who has known Rick for decades gives it a weight that it would not have coming from a narrator or from Rick himself. Bird Person's death in the Season 2 finale, and his resurrection as the villainous Phoenix Person in Season 3, and his eventual recovery and re-establishment as Bird Person again, is one of the show's longer arcs for a supporting character. The trajectory tells you something about what the show values in the Rick Bird-person friendship. The friendship can survive the most extreme form of betrayal, specifically the weaponization of Bird-person's body against the person who cares most about him. It can survive this because the friendship was built on something real and long-standing, something that predates the show's events and that cannot be entirely undone. Squanchy is another of Rick's old friends who appears less frequently but whose emotional function is similar to Bird-person's. He is evidence of a life, a network of relationships, a period before the isolation that characterizes Rick's present. The show does not develop him as fully as Bird-person, but his presence in the wedding episode and in the aftermath of the Season 2 finale contributes to the portrait of Rick as someone who once had and still has at a distance, a social world that he has mostly chosen to hold at arm's length. Mr. Poopy Butthole is one of the show's most formally interesting supporting characters because his function is entirely structural. He appears in the episode Total Rickle as what appears to be a family friend, a genial and cheerful character who has apparently been in the family's life for years. The episode's premise involves parasites who implant false memories, and the family spends the episode trying to determine who is real. Mr. Poopy Butthole passes the test of having bad memories as well as good ones, is established as genuinely real, and then is shot by Beth when she misjudges the evidence. The end of the episode reveals that Mr. Poopy Butthole was real. He was not a parasite. Beth shot an innocent family friend. The show then periodically returns to Mr. Poopy Butthole across several seasons to show his recovery from the shooting, his physical therapy, his life continuing. This is extraordinary for a show that typically treats collateral damage as unremarkable. The fact that Beth's mistake is tracked and returned to, the fact that Mr. Poopy Butthole's suffering is kept visible, is the show insisting that this particular cost not be absorbed and forgotten in the way that most costs in the show are absorbed and forgotten. The post-credits scene in the Season 3 episode Pickle Rick, in which Mr. Poopy Butthole appears to address the audience directly, is one of the show's most direct breaks of the fourth wall and one of its most effectively deployed surprise moments. He encourages the audience to go to therapy, speaking from his own experience of recovery. The moment is brief and played with warmth, and is also, within the context of an episode that is extensively about the avoidance of therapy, an important final note. Tammy is a character whose arc is driven entirely by the reveal at the end of Season 2. She appears earlier as Summer's friend, as a normal teenager participating in a subplot about a house party, before being revealed as a Federation sleeper agent who has been manipulating her way into Rick's social circle for years. The reveal retroactively reframes every scene she appeared in, which is the show's most effective deployment of this technique, because Tammy's friendliness was so thoroughly established as genuine that the retroactive reframing produces genuine discomfort rather than the satisfaction of an anticipated twist. Tammy returns in later seasons as an ongoing antagonist, and her arc develops in ways that include the suggestion that her feelings about the people she deceived may have become more complicated than a simple mission objective. The show does not fully commit to this reading. Tammy may be genuinely capable of calculation at a level that makes apparent emotional development into another layer of manipulation. Or she may have been changed by the relationships she built while pretending to build them. The show holds the question open. Principal Vagina is one of the show's most persistently underused recurring characters, appearing as the principal of Morty and Summer's school across multiple seasons with a name joke that overstays its welcome, but a character function that is genuinely useful. He is the representative of the institutional world, the world of rules and authority and normal expectations that Rick moves through with contempt. His consistent bewilderment at the Smith family's circumstances serves as a calibration for how abnormal those circumstances are. The more normal he is, the more abnormal they are by contrast. The school counselor, Mr. Goldenfold, who appears most notably in the Lawnmower Dog episode when Rick and Morty enter a dream version of his subconscious, is another representative of the institutional world. The Lawnmower Dog episode uses Goldenfold's dream as a setting for a plot about teaching Morty's dog to be intelligent. But the content of Goldenfold's subconscious is the episode's most interesting material. His dreams reveal a fantasy life that is mundane in its specificity, which the show plays as comedy, but which also functions as a portrait of a person whose imagination is bounded by exactly the kind of ordinary desires that Rick holds in contempt. Goldenfold dreams of being respected, of being seen, of the things that matter to everyone who is not Rick Sanchez. Aberdolf Linkler, who appears only in the Season 1 episode Rixie Business, is one of the show's most poignant one-episode characters. He is a genetic hybrid of Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler, created by Rick as an experiment in creating a morally neutral superleader. The experiment failed. Aberdolf Linkler has both sets of values simultaneously and cannot reconcile them, cannot commit to either set, and is therefore in constant torment. He dies in the episode's climax in a way the show acknowledges as genuinely sad. Aberdolf Linkler is a character built entirely out of an extended joke, but the joke has a point. The attempt to create someone without a moral orientation, to take the ethics out of a person by mixing opposing ethics until they cancel each other, produces something in pain rather than something free. The absence of moral commitment is not peace. It is a different kind of suffering. Rick's attempt to engineer a morally neutral being is another version of his tendency to treat people as engineering projects, and the result, as usual, is a being in agony. Morty's friend from school, whose name varies between appearances, is not a significant character, but the relationship serves a structural function. It is evidence that Morty has or had a life outside of Rick's adventures. The school friendships are rarely developed in depth, but they are present enough to establish that Morty is not entirely contained by the Rick-Morty dynamic. He has the ordinary social struggles of a teenager. His life extends beyond the portal gun. The alien villain who appears across multiple seasons and who is named Concerto, or alternatively the episode's primary antagonist of a given week, represents the show's approach to villains as a category. Rick and Morty is notably uninterested in villains as sustained antagonists. Most of the show's memorable villains appear for 1 or 2 episodes and are then resolved. The show does not organize itself around a villain's project the way that many serialized shows do. The sustained antagonist, the being whose goal threads through multiple seasons, is Evil Morty, and Evil Morty is not exactly a villain. He is a product of the system rather than a threat from outside it. The Galactic Federation, which serves as a governmental antagonist across multiple seasons, is interesting in the Iceberg because it is the show's most explicitly political external structure. The Federation governs the universe with bureaucratic efficiency, and its governance, when you see it in action, is exactly as appealing as bureaucratic governance tends to be in practice. The Season 3 premiere spends time with the Smith family living under Federation occupation, and the occupation is not brutal. It is banal. The Federation gives them comfortable jobs and comfortable houses and asks for compliance. The horror is the softness of it, the way the compliance is extracted not through force but through comfort and convenience and the gradual atrophying of the will to resist. Rick defeats the Federation not through heroism but through sabotage. He installs a virus in the Federation's computer network from inside his own extracted memory. The victory is technical, not moral. The Federation does not change because someone demonstrated that it was wrong. It collapses because someone broke its infrastructure. The show is making an observation about how institutional power actually ends, which is not usually through moral persuasion. Unity, Rick's hive mind former lover, has been discussed in terms of the autoerotic assimilation episode. But Unity's significance in the Iceberg extends beyond that single episode. The existence of Unity is evidence that Rick's relational capacity extends beyond the family. He was capable of a relationship with a being of extraordinary scope and complexity. He fell in love with something that contained multitudes. And the relationship ended not because Rick was incapable of love, but because his presence made the beloved worse. This is the specific shape of Rick's relational damage. He is not incapable of connection. He damages the things he connects with. This is different from simply being unable to connect. Someone who is unable to connect does not threaten other people by connecting. Rick's problem is more specific and more tragic. He connects, and the connection hurts the other person, and he is aware of this at some level, which is why the connection always ends in withdrawal. The pattern with Unity is the pattern with the family. The difference is that the family does not write him a letter explaining why they are leaving. They stay. And the staying is its own kind of commitment that Rick cannot quite allow himself to accept. The iceberg analysis of Rick and Morty tends to stay at the level of narrative and character, which misses a layer of the show that rewards attention. Its visual language and the way the show's production design makes arguments that the dialogue does not make explicitly. The ship is the show's most visually significant recurring element outside of the house. Rick's spaceship is organic looking rather than mechanical, rounded, and biomorphic in a way that is unusual for science fiction iconography. Its interior is comfortable in the way that a familiar space becomes comfortable, personalized rather than institutional. The ship is not a weapon. It is a home that travels. The show treats it as such, which is a quiet statement about what Rick actually wants from his adventures. He is not building a base of operations. He is extending the domestic space into the universe. The Citadel's visual design is explicitly institutional in a way that the ship is not. It is angular, constructed, efficient. The visual contrast between the ship and the Citadel is a contrast between Rick's personal world and the institutional world he has spent his life refusing. The Citadel looks like the thing Rick would have built if he had chosen to join the Council of Ricks and participate in collective governance. The ship looks like the thing he built instead. The house is visually significant as the show's constant, the element that all the adventures depart from and return to. The house is generic in the best possible sense. It is exactly what a house in this demographic and economic situation would look like. It is not aspirational. It does not have the visual distinctiveness of a designed space. It is a house. The kitchen table is a kitchen table. The living room couch is a living room couch. The show places its most extreme content in the most ordinary visual context it can find, and the contrast is part of the show's formal argument. The extraordinary and the ordinary are not separate categories. They coexist in the same domestic space. Rick's lab in the garage is the visual space that most clearly externalizes his character. It is chaotic on the surface, full of equipment and projects in various states of completion, and it is also extremely functional. Everything in there is there for a reason that Rick knows even if no one else does. The lab is a portrait of a mind that is organized according to a logic that is not communicable to other people, that prioritizes function over appearance, that accumulates rather than curates. It looks like a mess. It works perfectly. The portal gun is the most visually recognizable element of the show's iconography and the one whose design most directly communicates the show's aesthetic philosophy. The portal gun is small and apparently simple. It does not look like the most powerful object in the universe. It looks like something someone made in their garage, which is exactly what it is. The infinite multiverse, the ability to go anywhere, to escape any consequence, to access any version of any reality, fits in a device that a person can hold in one hand. This is a statement about what power looks like in the show's universe, which is not what power usually looks like in science fiction. Power in most science fiction is large and impressive and surrounded by institutional infrastructure. Power in Rick and Morty is small and personal and available to someone who has the knowledge to use it and the willingness to accept the consequences. The animation style itself communicates things about the show's relationship to its own content. The style is deliberately cartoon-like in a way that creates distance from the show's more extreme content. When Rick kills a large number of people in the Pickle Rick sequence, the violence is happening in a visual register that the brain processes differently from realistic violence. The show is aware of this and uses it deliberately. The animation style is the formal mechanism that allows the show to go to places that a realistic visual register would make unwatchable. It is not an accident that the show looks like a cartoon. The cartoonishness is the show's permission structure. The character designs, particularly for the alien and non-human characters, tend toward the organic and often grotesque. The show's alien designs are not the sleek, technologically impressive aliens of most science fiction. They are lumpy, odd-shaped, sometimes repulsive. They are aliens the way a mind unconstrained by cinematic convention would design aliens, strange, specific, not particularly interested in being appealing. This visual approach keeps the show's universe from feeling too comfortable, too designed to be navigated. It feels genuinely strange, which is the correct feeling for a universe that the show insists on treating as genuinely strange. The recurring visual motif of the portal itself, the green swirling opening between dimensions, is worth analyzing for what it communicates. Portals in the show are not the clean dimensional gateways of other science fiction. They are somewhat organic looking, slightly disturbing, not fully resolved at their edges. They look like wounds in space. Passing through them is not shown as comfortable. The visual design of the portal is the show saying that moving between dimensions is not a convenient transportation method. It is an unnatural act. It is, in the deepest sense, not supposed to be possible, and the visual of the portal holds the wrongness of it even when the characters treat it as routine. Rick and Morty's musical choices are one of the show's most underanalyzed elements, and the Iceberg community has spent surprisingly little time on them relative to their importance. The show's theme music, written and performed by Ryan Elder, is one of the most effectively dissonant theme songs in recent television history. It is built around a melody that is simultaneously catchy and slightly wrong, harmonically resolved in ways that feel just off enough to create unease alongside the energy. The theme tells you something about the show's register. It is trying to be exciting and fun, and it is also trying to make you slightly uncomfortable, and both things are happening at the same time. Elder has also composed the episode's specific music that underlies the show's most significant emotional moments. The piece that plays under the ending of the episode, Autoerotic Assimilation, when Rick sits alone in the garage, is one of the most carefully composed pieces in the show's musical catalog. It does not dramatize the moment, it does not tell you how to feel. It sits alongside the image and allows the image to carry the weight. The use of licensed music in the show is also significant. The show has a history of deploying specific songs at specific moments in ways that add layers of meaning that the dialogue and the image alone do not contain. The season 2 finale ends with a specific piece of music that underscores the scale and finality of Rick's surrender in a way that the scene's dialogue does not underline. The choice of music is a statement about the emotional register the show is asking you to inhabit. The sound design of the portal gun, the specific audio of the dimensional opening, is a piece of sonic branding that is as recognizable as any visual element of the show. The sound was designed to feel both technological and slightly organic, both exciting and slightly wrong. It is the audio equivalent of the portal's visual design, exciting in the way of something that should not be possible, and slightly disturbing in the same way. Rick's belch, which is improvisational in origin and became definitional to the character, has a specific audio quality that is worth noting. It is not a simple sound effect. It is a performed sound produced by Roiland in the recording booth, and its irregularity, the fact that it varies slightly from instance to instance, is part of its realism. If the belch were a consistent sound effect, it would lose the quality of being Rick's specific voice breaking down around him, which is what it communicates dramatically. It is Rick's intelligence failing him in a minor way, repeatedly, as evidence that the performance costs something. The show's use of silence is also significant. Rick and Morty is not a show that leaves a lot of space in its audio. It is dense, layered, fast-moving. The moments when the show goes quiet, when the music drops and the dialogue stops, and you are left with ambiance, are moments the show marks as significant. The garage scene at the end of Autoerotic Assimilation uses quiet in this way. So does the ending of the Season 2 finale. The show teaches you, over its runtime, to read silence as weight. No iceberg analysis of Rick and Morty is complete without acknowledging the specific shape of the show's fandom and the way that fandom has sometimes been in tension with the show's own content. Rick and Morty attracted, from early in its run, a subset of fans who engaged with Rick specifically as a figure of aspirational identification. Rick is the smartest person in the universe. He does whatever he wants. He does not answer to anyone. He sees through the systems that constrain ordinary people and navigates above them. To an audience that values intelligence, that feels unappreciated, that is looking for permission to treat social obligations as optional, Rick is a flattering mirror. The show itself, as noted elsewhere in this iceberg, is aware of this and does not endorse it. The show keeps showing you the cost. It keeps showing you Rick's loneliness, his damage, the suffering he produces in the people around him. The show does not want you to be Rick. It wants you to understand Rick, which is a different project. But the audience that was looking for flattering identification received it regardless of the show's intentions, because the show's intentions are not fully separable from the surface of what it shows you. If the surface shows you a genius being effortlessly superior to everyone around him, some portion of the audience will take that surface reading and set aside the layers beneath it. The community that developed around the show on platforms like Reddit built significant infrastructure for analysis, theory, and discussion. At its best, this infrastructure produced some of the most sophisticated analysis of any animated series, careful, evidence-based, attentive to the show's structure and to the evidence it provides. At its worst, it produced a culture of superiority, in which the ability to decode the show's references and predict its twists became a performance of the same kind of intelligence that Rick performs, with the same results. Dan Harmon's public engagement with the show's fandom has been honest and sometimes uncomfortable. He has spoken about the tension between wanting to make a show that a large audience enjoys and making a show that sometimes criticizes the behavior of that audience. He has spoken about the difficulty of watching something you made become a cultural signal for a set of values that are not the values the thing was made to express. The show's response to this tension has been embedded in the text rather than external to it. Episodes like One Crew over the Cuckoo's Morty and elements of earlier episodes comment on the fandom's relationship to the show by being about the relationship between an audience and the thing it consumes. The show cannot address its fandom directly. It can address its fandom through the story, which it does periodically and which some of the fandom has recognized and some has not. The show has also attracted, over its run, the kind of academic and critical attention that was once reserved for prestige live-action drama. Philosophy professors have written papers about the show's engagement with Camus and Nietzsche. Psychology researchers have written about the show's portrayal of depression and addiction. Science writers have written about the show's use of quantum mechanics. This layer of academic engagement is evidence of the show's actual ambition, the ambition to operate at multiple registers simultaneously and to be rewarding at all of them. The merchandise culture around the show is worth noting in the iceberg, not as a criticism, but as evidence of the show's cultural penetration. Rick and Morty merchandise exists at a scale that places it alongside the most commercially successful animated franchises in history. The show's iconography, the portal gun, the characters' visual design, the catchphrases, has been reproduced on an enormous range of products. This commercial success is separable from the show's artistic merit, and the iceberg is more interested in the latter than the former. But the scale of the commercial success is evidence of the show's cultural reach, which is itself evidence of how deeply it has resonated with an audience large enough to sustain significant commercial interest. The show's relationship to other animated series that followed in its wake is also worth noting. Rick and Morty was not the first adult animated series to combine science fiction with emotional depth and philosophical ambition. But it arrived at a moment when the format was receptive to it, when Adult Swim's programming philosophy and the expanding landscape of streaming television had created space for the kind of ambition it was exercising. In its wake, a significant number of animated series have attempted similar combinations, with varying degrees of success. The show's influence on the format is visible across the animated landscape of the decade following its premiere. At the very bottom of the iceberg, beneath all of the episode analysis and the production history and the fan theories and the cultural context, there is a simple question that the show has been asking since the pilot, and that it has not yet definitively answered. Can a person who has been broken in the specific way that Rick has been broken still love? And can that love be enough? The show has been circling this question for its entire run. Every episode is, at some level, an investigation of the question. The adventures are the vehicle. The question is the destination. Rick's damage is specific and documented. He experienced a catastrophic loss. He built a self around the loss that was designed to be invulnerable. He maintained that self through intelligence and contempt and chemical assistance and the systematic avoidance of anything that would require him to feel the thing he was avoiding. He did this for a long time. Long enough that the original loss is now buried under layers of learned behavior that function independently of the original wound. Even if you removed the original wound, Rick would still be what he is. The pattern has its own momentum now. And yet, he keeps going back. He keeps maintaining the relationship with Morty. He keeps living in the house with the family. He keeps making choices under pressure that reveal what is underneath the performance. The season 2 finale is the biggest of these choices, but the show has been documenting smaller versions of it across its entire run. Rick, stripped of the performance, chooses the people he loves. He chooses them imperfectly, with methods that are sometimes cruel and always insufficient. But he chooses them. The show's argument is not that love cures damage. Rick is not going to recover in the way that a therapeutic narrative would require. The damage is too long-standing, too thoroughly integrated into the self, too constitutive of who Rick is, for recovery to mean what recovery usually means. What the show argues instead is something more honest and more difficult. That love and damage can coexist. That a person can be broken and still love. That the love does not fix the brokenness, and the brokenness does not invalidate the love. That both are real simultaneously. Morty's arc, read as the show's counter-argument to Rick's position, develops the case for a different way of living in the universe. Morty has been exposed to everything Rick has been exposed to. He knows what the universe is. He knows about the infinite dimensions, the Citadel, the systematic exploitation of beings like himself, the indifference of a universe that contains everything and cares about nothing. He knows all of this, and he has known it for a long time. His response is to keep caring about people, to keep reaching toward connection, to remain curious about the universe rather than contemptuous of it, to find things funny, to feel things fully rather than armoring against them. This is not innocence. Morty is not innocent by the end of any season of the show. He has done things and seen things and survived things that no innocent person could have done and seen and survived. But he has not become hardened by them in the way that the experience should, by any reasonable expectation, have hardened him. This is the show's most optimistic statement, expressed not as a lesson but as a portrait. It is possible to be inside a system that uses you, to absorb genuine darkness, to lose things that matter and to face knowledge that should destroy you, and to come out the other side as someone who can still laugh and care and try, not unchanged, not undamaged, but still capable of the ordinary human things that the damage was supposed to make impossible. Rick cannot do this. Rick looked at the same universe that Morty has looked at and built a wall. Morty has looked at the same universe and built a root. The difference between them is not intelligence. It is a willingness to remain soft in a universe that keeps offering reasons to harden. The show keeps going because the distance between them is the most interesting territory it has found. Rick moving incrementally and reluctantly toward the possibility that Morty represents. Morty moved repeatedly into the darkness that Rick inhabits and returning from it with his softness intact. The adventures are the medium. The movement is the story. Where it ends is not yet determined. The central finite curve is gone. The wider multiverse is open. Evil Morty is out there in dimensions the show has not shown you. Rick is operating in a universe that no longer guarantees his supremacy. The family is as complicated as it has always been. The show is sitting at the edge of something larger than what it has shown you so far. Whether it walks through that door and what it finds there is the question the iceberg leaves open at its very bottom. It is enough to have gone this deep, to have seen the shape of what the show has been building, layer by layer from the surface to the center. To understand that the nihilism is the setup and the love is the punchline, and the punchline keeps landing because the setup was done honestly. The universe is vast and indifferent. People are small and specific, and the small specific people keep finding each other in the vast indifferent universe and making something that matters in the time they have. That is the whole iceberg. That is, underneath everything, what the show is about. There is a layer of the iceberg that deals with the show's relationship to its own medium, to the specific formal properties of animation as a storytelling tool, and this layer rewards attention that it does not always receive. Rick and Morty exists in a tradition of animated series for adult audiences that stretches back through Futurama and South Park and King of the Hill, and before that through the late-night programming experiments that Adult Swim was built to house. Each of these shows found a different answer to the question of what animation can do that live action cannot. South Park found that the crudeness of the visual style was a permission structure for political satire that would be too pointed in any other form. Futurama found that animation allowed the consistent maintenance of a science fiction world at a visual scale that would be prohibitively expensive in live action. King of the Hill found that a deliberately undramatic visual style could make the understatement of its comedy more precise. Rick and Morty's answer to the question of what animation can do is more specific than any of these. Its visual style, deliberately referencing the aesthetic of mid-90s cable animation, creates a register of comfortable recognition that allows the show to go to places that would be unwatchable if presented more realistically. The universe the show inhabits looks like a children's cartoon. The content of what happens in that universe is frequently appropriate only for adults and sometimes genuinely disturbing. The gap between the visual register and the content register is not incidental. It is the mechanism the show uses to make extreme content emotionally processable. The show has been self-aware about this from the beginning. The pilot's cold open, which threatens Morty's life in what appears to be genuine sincerity and then reveals itself as a dream, is doing this work explicitly. It is establishing that the visual register will not protect you from the content, that looking like a cartoon does not mean functioning like one. The show tells you this in its first 90 seconds and then spends its entire run honoring the promise. The visual evolution of the show across its seasons is worth tracking. The first season's animation is rougher than what followed, with a quality that matches the improvisational energy of Roiland's recording process. The roughness is not a flaw. It is consistent with the show's early identity as something made by people who were figuring out what they were making. By the second season, the animation had become more confident, the cinematography more deliberately composed, the color palette more precisely managed. By the third season, the show was using its visual resources with considerable sophistication. The camera placement and the visual design of specific episodes reflecting the emotional register the writing was working in. The Reclantis mix-up, the Season 3 episode that follows multiple storylines on the Citadel, uses visual language to distinguish the storylines from each other. The police procedural storyline has a color palette and lighting scheme drawn from realistic crime drama. The Factory Morty storyline has the flat, efficient visual language of a workplace documentary. The episode's visual intelligence matches its narrative intelligence, which is part of what makes it the achievement it is. The show's use of visual metaphor extends to character design choices that reward attention. Rick's spiky hair, his lab coat, his permanent 5 o'clock shadow together form a visual shorthand for the mad scientist archetype. But the show uses this shorthand deliberately. Rick looks like what people think a genius looks like, which is part of the point. His appearance is a costume in the same way his persona is a costume. The visual design is the character's performance of itself, and the character's performance of itself is always one layer removed from what is underneath. Morty's design is its counterpart. He is soft where Rick is angular, uncertain where Rick projects confidence, his body language perpetually slightly wrong for his environment. The visual contrast between them is the show's argument in visual form. These are two people at different distances from their own vulnerability, and the distance is visible in how they take up space. The show's most formally ambitious visual choices appear in the moments where it departs from its default register. The Season 5 finale's origin story sequence, rendered in a deliberately softened and warmer animation style, signals through its visual departure that what you are being shown is memory and loss rather than present action. The visual shift does the emotional work before the dialogue does. You know you are in the past, and you know the past carries a specific kind of weight, before anyone tells you this. This is the show using its medium at the highest level. Animation allows a degree of control over the visual register that is not available to live action. Every element of the frame can be designed. When the show chooses to design a sequence differently from its default, the choice is intentional and loaded. The iceberg traces the content of the show, but the form of the show, the decisions made at the level of image and sound and visual rhythm, is carrying content too. The form is never neutral in Rick and Morty. It is always in conversation with what the story is doing, commenting on it, or amplifying it, or, occasionally, contradicting it in ways that tell you something the words are not saying directly. That layer, the formal layer beneath the narrative and the thematic, is where the iceberg finds its final tier. Not in the mythology, or the philosophy, or the production history, but in the craft. The decisions made at the level of a shot's composition, or a sequence's visual register, or a theme's instrumental color. The craft that makes the whole thing cohere, and that operates, like Rick's care for his family, largely beneath the surface of what presents itself most obviously to the eye. Rick and Morty has been one of the most discussed and analyzed animated series of the past decade, and the conversations have not slowed down. It has been dissected and theorized about and performed for and occasionally worshipped, and occasionally used as a personality type, and occasionally treated as something its creators have had to publicly and carefully push back against. Through all of that, the show has kept going. Kept building its portrait of this specific damaged man and this specific resilient kid, kept finding new angles on the same set of questions. At its best, the show is doing something that is genuinely difficult to do. It is being honest about what the universe looks like from a position of too much knowledge, and it is also being honest about the fact that too much knowledge does not exempt you from needing people. Rick is the proof of the first part. Morty is the proof of the second. The show needs both of them, and the space between them to say what it is trying to say. What it is trying to say is something that the best of the show earns through the worst of the show. You have to go through the void to get to the warmth, because the warmth is only meaningful if you have actually sat in the void first. A love declared against a background of indifference is not the same as a love declared against a background of comfortable certainty. Rick and Morty makes you earn the warmth. It makes you sit in the nihilism long enough that when the warmth breaks through, when Rick makes the choice that costs him something, when Morty says the thing that is actually about absurdism rather than despair, it lands with the weight of everything that came before it. That is what the iceberg looks like from the bottom. A show that uses infinite space to talk about very small and